Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Welcome to day 7 of our conference, which is the last day and the last session. And I'm very excited with this session. It is not your normal presentation type Q&A. Actually, we're joined by 5 eminent scholars that we will engage in a 2-hour discussion on various topics. So it is my pleasure to be in their company, and they will be introduced shortly. But first, I would like to introduce my co-moderator. My co-moderator is Owais Khan. Owais is a senior research associate at SIGA, the Center for Islam and Global Affairs here at Istanbul Sabah ad-Din Zaim University. Is also a PhD candidate in the Department of Religion at Syracuse University. He served as a lecturer at Fatih Sultan Mehmet University's Alliance of Civilizations Institute in Istanbul between 2010 and 2012. He is currently, of course, also a lecturer at Sabah ad-Din Zaim University. At Syracuse, his dissertation explores the theological foundations of modern sovereignty and the ways Islamic political theory and practice can help to resolve perennial problems in modern political theory. Owais.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm excited to welcome all of our viewers and our scholars. We're looking forward to having a very lively debate in the last session here as a closing summary session to kind of bring together all the themes that we've discussed over the course of the conference. I would thank Dr. Sami for the kind introduction. It is also my privilege to be hosting this session with Dr. Sami. For all those who are tuning in, Dr. Sami Al-Arian is the director of the Center for Islam and Global Affairs. He's the public affairs professor at Istanbul Sabah ad-Din Zaim University. He received his PhD in 1986 and accumulated a number of teaching awards at the University of South Florida, where he was a tenured faculty member. During his 4 decades in the US, he founded a number of institutions, both in the fields of education and also in interfaith dialogue. He's also been a leading advocate for civil and human rights in the United States. His struggle for human rights led him to lose his tenure-track position and was accused of many unjust allegations against him and his person due to his struggle against secret evidence in the United States. Since then, Dr. Sami Al-Arian has been residing in Turkey. He has been featured in a number of documentaries, and he writes prolifically on a number of issues, including the Arab world, geopolitics, the state of Palestine, and human rights. So with that introduction, I'm sure the viewers are now well acquainted with the moderators. I will go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Sami to introduce our scholars.
Thank you, Owais, for this generous introduction. I would like to first introduce our eminent guest and scholar, Professor John Esposito. John is a university professor of Religion and International Affairs and of Islamic Studies, as well as the founding director of the Walid bin Talal Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. He has more than 50 books, one of the most prolific authors in the United States. Most of his books have been translated into more than 40 languages. The past president of the American Academy of Religion, the Middle East Studies Association of North America, and vice chair of the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy. Professor Esposito also has been a member of the World Economic Forum's Council of 100 Leaders and the European Community's Network of Experts on De-Radicalization, as well as been an advisor and served as a consultant to many governments, corporations, universities, and of course, media worldwide. Another panelist that we are very proud to have, we just concluded a session with her. She was moderating that. Now I'm returning the favor, is Dr. Heba Raouf Ezzat. She is currently on the faculty of the Political Science Department at Ibn Khaldun University here in Istanbul. She was an assistant professor of political science and deputy director of the Center for Humanities and Interdisciplinary Studies at Cairo University, as well as an adjunct professor at the American University in Cairo. She also was a visiting fellow and academic at many universities, including Oxford University, University of Westminster, University of California at Berkeley, Georgetown, and many others. She received her degrees, bachelor, master's, and PhD from the University of Cairo in political science, in all of them. She's researched and written on many topics, including global civil society, building global democracy, women in politics, faith and citizenship, as well as social movements in Islam. She has also many books to her credit, including one of the most famous, The Political Imagination of Islamist Conceptual Analysis. Owais will introduce our three other panelists. Owais.
Thank you, Dr. Sami. We have also accompanying Dr. Esposito and Dr. Ezzat, Professor Dr. Hamid Mousavi. He's a professor at the Faculty of Law and Political Science at the University of Tehran. He has also been a visiting professor at the Department of Science at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. His research interests include Israeli foreign policy, US foreign policy, the Middle East. He is currently writing a book on the role of ideology in Israeli foreign policy. Dr. Mousavi is a regular on as a political analyst and many channels and news shows. Accompanying him is Dr. Professor Ismail Yaylacı, who is currently a faculty member at Fatih Sultan Mehmet University. He was an assistant professor and department chair of the Political Science International Relations Department at Istanbul Şehir University. He attained his undergraduate degree in political science from Boğaziçi and completed his master's in political science, international relations, same institution, with a thesis titled A Democratic Realist Foreign Policy, U.S. Democracy Promotion in the Middle East. He completed his doctoral studies at the University of Minnesota, and his dissertation was on performative secularization in world politics. Since then, Dr. Yaylacı has co-authored a book, Civilization and World Order, Geopolitics and Cultural Difference. And he has also appeared in publications such as the Divan Journal of Interdisciplinary Studies, the IJMEE, the Analish magazine, Anlayış magazine, sorry. His research includes international relations theory, norms and institutions, global governance, Turkish foreign policy, Middle East politics, and a host of other pertinent topics. And last but not least, we have Dr. Abdullah Al-Arian, who's an associate professor of history at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service in Qatar. He received his doctorate from Georgetown University in history in 2011. He wrote his dissertation on the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. Dr. Al-Arian received several awards that allowed him to conduct field research in many different countries. His book, entitled Answering the Call, Popular Islamic Activism in Sadat's Egypt, was published by Oxford in 2014. He's working on a second book project that explores the relationship between nationalism and Islamism, or the tendency of Islamic political movements to adopt the nation-state paradigm. Dr. Al-Arian teaches courses on politics in the Middle East, history in the Middle East. He also covers more specialized topics such as history of modern Egypt, Islamic social movements, Islam, law, and society. He's a frequent contributor to Al Jazeera and other news networks as a political analyst. And we welcome Dr. Al-Arian. I want to take this moment to welcome all of the panelists, and we will open up with opening statements by each panelist. They will have 4 minutes each. The topic that we have in mind is to discuss the future of politics and political transformation in the Islamic world. And I'm sure all our viewers will find that all of the specialists here are well equipped to give us their insights on what is in store for the Muslims and the Islamic world in the near future. I first would like to open with giving the floor to Dr. John Esposito. The floor is yours. You have to unmute yourself, sir. Dr. Esposito, I'm not able to hear you. Are other people able to hear him in the conference? No, no one's able to. You might have to switch to the English channel.
In the lower bar, on the very right.
Okay, Dr. Esposito, while you figure that out, I'm going to let another panelist begin their opening statements, and we'll turn back to you at the end of the round. Dr. Heba Raouf Ezzat.
Yes.
Could you start us off with your opening statements, please?
Yeah. Bismillah. I think that we were supposed to think basically about the future and see how the Muslim Ummah would develop, and Muslim politics and authority, governance, and sovereignty in a way. And I think that one of the issues that deserve attention would be this disappearance of the boundaries between the civil and the military in a way. Not only the taking of power by the military in different countries and the exercise of excessive force, but also how the presence of the military forces in the civil sphere and in the economic sphere, etc., like in the case of Egypt, for example, actually transforms the nature of civility in society. Of course, we had previous research done on that in the Egyptian case that can actually be also looked at from a different perspective regarding North Africa, but generally in the South, the global South. Like Dr. Anwar Abdel Malik's book about Egypt as a military society. But the transformations are actually taking a very urban turn in a way. So we have the new capital in Egypt at the moment being built with a quite a huge space devoted to the Ministry of Defense. And we also have more and more separation between the military society and its basically surroundings, families, sports clubs, etc., and society at large. And at the same time, with the presence of the military symbols in the public sphere, there is a transformation of culture as well. And this can be seen in different countries, not only in the Egyptian case that I'm more aware of. So I think that more attention should be given in understanding the Ummah and its politics in the future, how actually we need to redefine the notion of politics and to see the different spheres of territoriality and sovereignty in a more complex way. And hence, the notion of the political itself would be changing. On the other hand, the notion of the Ummah needs to be reconceptualized in a very complex way. So we have the religious Ummah, but also we have the political Ummah that includes non-Muslims, includes different ethnicities, etc. And the expansion over a huge geographical space, which is the globe at the moment, it poses a lot of challenges regarding building at least a thin identity that is shared by everyone when it comes to different social media influence on the youth, when it comes to the official Islam and its relation to the practice of everyday life, and how Muslims understand the religiosity under authoritarian regimes, etc. So also this building of a notion of an ummah that is more complex than what we had in the last 200 years, using this concept in a more either geostrategic, political, cartographic manner, or in a very solid manner in terms of identity. I think these two dimensions will have a very important effect on the future of our understanding of politics, authority, and sovereignty in the Muslim world and globally as well.
Thank you very much, Professor Ezzat. Dr. Esposito, are you?
Try me now. Can you hear me
Yes.
now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. All right. Now, just hold on a second.
So you have 4 minutes for your opening statement. You can go ahead.
Okay. The slogan, "The people want to overthrow the regime," united protesters in the Arab uprising or Arab Spring, who toppled regimes in Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya, an act that powerfully captured the imagination of the people in the MENA region. Fear that the uprisings in the Arab Spring would set an example, excuse me, would set an example, inspire and affect regimes in the Gulf, that led Gulf states, in particular Saudi Arabia and the UAE, to pump billions of dollars into Egypt to support the overthrow of Mohamed Morsi, the first democratically elected president of Egypt, and to support the new Sisi regime. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain, fearing problems at home, pursued a policy of enhanced securitization, which also meant enhanced repression. More recently, political and socioeconomic conditions have led to popular protests in Algeria, Iraq, Iran, Lebanon, and Sudan. So that kind of makes a point in terms of feeling that, well, when everything was shut down with regard to Egypt, etc., that nothing more was going to happen. We do see that there's still, in terms of popular protest, in terms of populations and what many want, and particularly youth, there's a concern, and I'll come back to this after. Despite deliberate cosmetic changes and reforms in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, they have in fact become more authoritarian and repressive. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have sought to be the dominant regional powers in the Middle East and moved to penalize Qatar and Turkey for their support of the Morsi government and continued support for the Muslim Brotherhood, providing a safe haven in their countries. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, joined by Bahrain and Egypt, severed its diplomatic relations with Qatar and banned Qatar airplanes and ships from their airspace and sea routes. What was the response in the West? Western powers like the US, UK, France compromised their ostensible commitment to democratization and human rights. Normally, these are countries that have always indicated a commitment to human rights. Now, the fact is, historically, even though they would say that, they have practiced democratic exceptionalism when it's come to the Middle East in terms of their actual policies in the past. They were supporters of the authoritarian governments in Tunisia and Egypt, etc. What's important here, too, in terms of where we are and where we may be going, is that Donald Trump noted on his visit to Saudi Arabia, the domestic policies of the government were not a concern of US foreign policy. So Trump, in a sense, also opened the door to that kind of approach. Indeed, I've known of a number of incidents of those, and particularly some in Bahrain and other places, who were being interrogated, and the interrogator, after this kind of statement was made by Trump, basically said to the person, well, we're really perfectly free to do what we want. The US, UK, and France, however, in fact, enjoyed significant contracts for their governments and corporations from the Saudis and from the UAE. This is very much in line with the Trump approach also, which is we fight extremism, we do big business, and he bragged about the billions of dollars with business, but what a country does And at home, that's its business. And that ties very well into the philosophy, if you will, of the Saudis and the UAE. In exchange, they've ignored the issues of freedom of speech and human rights. No wonder major polls have reported that the US and the rest, in general, have been perceived as having engaged in democratic exceptionalism in the Middle East. The US and France have also provided assistance to Saudi Arabia's bombing of civilian targets and institutions in Yemen, something that has been condemned by the UN. The Trump administration refused to respond to requests from Congress to provide a report determining who killed and dismembered the body of Jamal Khashoggi, a prominent Saudi journalist and Washington Post reporter. Now, I just want to make a few brief comments on where we've been just very recently, and that is the way in which the coronavirus has been used by these same authoritarian regimes to their advantage. Authoritarian rulers and governments have used the coronavirus crisis as an excuse to crack down on political and social dissent and opposition groups and reinforce authoritarian regulations. The Algerian government, for example, has used the virus for further political repression. Authorities sought to silence political protests that have occurred for more than a year and end their daily demonstrations, and they also continued to jail protesters. Egypt has had an even more robust approach. It furnished Egypt with yet another justification to tighten its control on the Egyptian people, political opposition, protest, and media information. Arrested people charged with spreading false information and rumors, such as how widespread COVID-19 really was and the failures of the government to adequately deal with it. In fact, it turned on New York Times and The Guardian reporters for really showing the very small numbers that initially the Egyptians were saying were the case were really completely incorrect. COVID-19's danger has been used as an excuse to impose the severe anti-demonstration laws and repression of press freedoms, and most continue its vendetta against the Muslim Brotherhood. The Brotherhood has been accused of attempting to spread the virus among military, police, judiciary, and members of the state media. The government used this as an excuse for a continued crackdown on suspended members of the organization, as well as for the continued imprisonment and detention without charges of tens of thousands of the group's members. The state of emergency has been used and extended repeatedly under the Sisi government as part of the government's fight against terrorism. A second wave of popular protest against authoritarian regimes. What's the status on that? And these are my concluding comments. We have seen post-Arab Spring popular protest in Algeria, Lebanon, Iran, Sudan, with the overthrow of the government in the Sudan, even if it's now under military rule. Major polling after the Arab Spring and today basically show that there's widespread support for political participation, good governance, anti-government corruption, human rights, and freedoms. Interestingly enough, in some of that polling, it goes directly against people within a country, going directly against what the government and a repressive government is actually saying. However, a desire for more open societies and change exists and will no doubt continue to exist, and some accommodation will be inevitable, though frankly, it may take many years. And I think that's something to think about. I've been in a number of conversations recently where people have talked about that movement forward, and particularly looking to younger generations, feeling that older generations have sort of adapted. Many of them went through what happened with the Arab Spring and just feel if they can just get through their life, that's okay. But given the realities, it could take a decade or more. And I think that's one of the things that one needs to think about. I'll end there.
Thank you very much. Professor Mousavi.
Thank you. So I think I've written down 4 factors that I think will very much influence the future of politics in the Islamic world. The first one would be how we are able to establish a delicate bridge between Islam and modern governance. A lot of the challenges Muslim governments face today did not exist during the time of the Prophet, and there needs to be a relationship established between these two pillars without having any of the two. So without having either Islam or without having good governance principles, I think a lot of Muslim countries are going to have problems in the future. The second issue is, I think, economic transparency. My wife always says that there are only 2 verses in the Quran regarding hijab. And mind you, she wears the hijab herself. Yet we have many verses on economics. There are many verses on economic corruption, and also a lot of Quranic verses on the distribution of wealth. Nevertheless, in the Islamic world, usually we are very stringent in implementing rules on the hijab, for example, yet regarding economic corruption, usually we are either very lax or we are even indifferent. And I think this is a very major problem that Islamic countries need to face head on. The third issue that I think is important is being to engage global public opinion. We are living in a very interconnected world, and there is a lot of misunderstanding of Muslim societies. Now, this is partly due to how Muslims are demonized in foreign media, such as Hollywood movies. But I think an important part also goes back to how we explain our position and how we explain our values and our traditions, something that we haven't been able to do very well until now, and something that has to be remedied in the future. The fourth issue, and this is the fourth one, is actually where I'm more well versed in, is regarding international relations. I think it's very important for Muslim countries to be able to adopt independent foreign policies. When I say independent, I mean independent of foreign powers such as the United States or Russia or even China. And instead basing their foreign policy decisions on the interests of their own nations, as well as the interests of the Islamic Ummah. Now, taking into consideration the interests of the Islamic Ummah is not something that you see in international relations theory. I mean, you don't have such a thing in either realism or liberalism, for example. But I think it's very important for Muslim countries to feel an obligation towards the Islamic Ummah all over the world. And this is something that really needs to be remedied. On this same issue is one of the problems we face today in the Muslim world is that some governments, instead of deriving their legitimacy internally and from their own people, they rely on the security guarantees of foreign powers such as the United States. And the result of that is, rather than making foreign policy decisions on the wishes of the people, they make foreign policy decisions based on their security guarantors, such as the United States. And I think the most recent example of that is the establishment of political relations with Israel in recent weeks by, say, the UAE or Morocco or Bahrain. Something that we all know, and polls also show, that is not favored by the Arab masses, yet these governments make these decisions based on what Donald Trump wanted. And it all goes back to the issue of whether they derive their legitimacy internally or whether they rely on a foreign power. I'm going to stop right there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mousavi. Next, we'll have Dr. Yaylacı.
Thank you, Owais. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the effort you put in organizing this timely conference. I'm also glad to be in the presence of this distinct panel. I want to use these short 4 minutes to reflect on one aspect of the theme of the conference. And in some ways, it also nicely follows up on Dr. Mousavi's fourth point. In the earlier sessions, especially in the opening sessions, there was a nice discussion on the idea of the state. Dr. Heba also mentioned some of it. Now there is a burgeoning and productive scholarly discussion on the relationship between Islam, Sharia, and the modern state. And Professor Memdani and Professor Iqtidar highlighted the ways in which nationalism has been integral and constitutive part of the modern state and modern notion of popular sovereignty. Now I want to draw our attention to the international implications of this nation-state thinking and organization. Much of the discord between Muslim norms and political reality has to do with the modern norms of territoriality, sovereignty, and nationalism and the nation-state form. We live in a world of nations. Nations organize political life, defend borders, provide security, and regulate social life. In return, they demand obedience. They ask for submission to their project and discourse. The collective identity of being a member of Muslim community is constantly being overcome and dominated and domesticated by the major political community of modernity, that is the nation and the nation state. But still states cannot not want the nation state form. People in some ways are in the want of it, at least it seems so globally. This makes Muslim states, this puts Muslim states in the position of captives or conscripts of Westphalia, interacting with each other through the Westphalian framework. Over the last decade, there were talks about Westphalia, the failure of Westphalia, the shattering of the territorial nation state in the hands of the forces of globalization. There were also nationalists of various stripes who embarked on what was called Westphalia, falling in love with the Westphalian state with all its attendant norms and institutions. Territorial states with their ideologies of national interest are in bitter struggles right now for more power and influence. Muslim identity does not shape the lines of solidarity for much of the Muslim states. The big question for us here is the obvious one. How do we go beyond this vicious cycle of nationalism, conflict, and more nationalism? This loop that perpetually undermines Muslim solidarity. How to think of the Muslim Ummah at the world stage. One recent attempt by Salman Said calls for a reinstitution of caliphate in the form of a Muslim great power that can represent and protect all Muslims globally. Although Said thinks through a post-Westphalian logic, still that conception reproduces more than displaces, I think, Westphalia and paradoxically the nation thinking. It does so in the name of a Muslim realpolitik. Here we face another related question. What are the Sharia limits to state pursuit of national interest? What are the limitations to a Muslim realpolitik, if you will, both among Muslims and non-Muslims? If we are bound with the moral norms of Sharia, what are these norms in today's world politics that Muslim states' consideration of national interest would not be able to surpass? Again, in what ways thinking about Ummah is not a replication of nationalism at a larger scale? Some do argue that Ummatic identity is a form of nationalism, a form of Muslim nationalism. Then is Ummatic identity a replication of nationalism at a larger scale? Do we criticize nationalism only to reproduce it at a higher level? While we think and search for a political community beyond the nation state, we have no other option but to operate with what we have at our hands in order to reach anywhere. That is, we have to work with the institutions of the modern state. That's why we are captives, we are conscripts in some ways. Even within the confines of this framework, even within the confines of this Westphalian framework, there are plenty of unseized opportunities to further community formation among Muslims globally. That requires thinking more creatively about the design of new institutions and mechanisms that would facilitate cooperation among Muslim states, from economic interactions to culture. It also requires more efficient utilization of functional frameworks, such as regional organizations or trade settlements or trade deals. But of course, such institutions are consequences rather than causes of political will. That is why it requires us to think about ways to foster this will, the will to cooperate, the will to solidarity, to develop common institutions and solidarity. And I want to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me pass now for our final opening statement by Dr. Al-Arian.
Thank you so much for having me. So I want to start by, I guess for these comments to maybe identify 2 points of tension that I think are the sources of a lot of the kinds of fault lines or conflicts that we're seeing unfolding currently and sort of for the foreseeable future. But before that, I think by way of background, it's worth acknowledging what many of us have already mentioned, which is that, of course, now we are commemorating the 10-year anniversary of the events that sparked the Tunisian uprising. I think just yesterday was the official 10-year anniversary of Bouazizi's act of despair that triggered the events that launched the uprising in Tunis, and of course, with it, most of what we know today as the Arab Spring. But I want to point specifically to an article in The Guardian that was published this week. I don't know if some of you may have seen it, but in which it kind of profiles both the commemoration of the event and then kind of highlights the idea that many Tunisians now regret the revolution, that many Tunisians are sort of very vocal about the idea that things have actually gotten worse since they overthrew the previous regime. And they outline, of course, a number of the economic challenges, the uncertainties of the democratic transition, the political stalemates that have defined the country post Ben Ali. And I think this is by no means a marginal statement that we should ignore, but it's really a sentiment that I've seen I've encountered it in my classrooms over the last few years. It's very much popular, I think, among a generation that was probably too young to experience the uprisings firsthand, but they share this collective memory of it that views it largely as a failure, as a setback for the Arab region as a whole. And so I think one question we have to honestly ask ourselves is that if even Tunisia, which by other measures is seen as the one success story, still has this pervasive narrative of it being a mistake, then what might people be thinking about Egypt, about Yemen, Bahrain, Libya, or Syria for that matter? I think it's also quite illustrative that even as we look at the events and the protests more recently in places like Algeria, Sudan, Lebanon, and Iraq, that the people there have very explicitly stated that they want nothing to do with the Arab Spring label and that they instead see their movements as complete aberrations or independent of any sort of broader regional narrative. And so they don't want to see these uprisings as some kind of epiphenomenon. And I think this gets me to my first point of tension, which is that the war of narratives that's been waged across Arab societies for the past decade pits authoritarianism on the one hand against forces of change on the other. And you can characterize those forces of change however you want, whether you see them as reformist, as democratic, as revolutionary. But either way, just change versus sort of authoritarianism. And so in the aftermath, especially of the coup in Egypt and the civil wars in Libya, Syria, and Yemen, the pervasive narrative has it, of course, that authoritarianism equals stability, security, economic prosperity, and a regional order that's very much in tune with the global order, led, of course, by the US, the EU, the global economic institutions like the World Bank and the IMF and international economic markets. And of course, one only has to look at the celebration of Sisi by Macron in Egypt only the last couple of weeks when he was given the highest possible honor by the French government to see that this is very much part of a kind of unified narrative. And we've seen this narrative play out across multiple stages. We see it in media, in social media, in popular culture, in formal political structures, as well as informal political spaces and international forums. And given the massive power imbalance, I think the perceived failure of the 2010-2011 revolutions, it's clear that not only is authoritarianism itself in the ascendancy, but the idea of authoritarianism has also gained currency in recent years. And I think this is a really important, although subtle distinction, but it's a crucial one. And I'd be remiss, of course, if we don't acknowledge that this is a phenomenon that clearly has global appeal, because we've seen, of course, the rise in momentum of authoritarianism in the United States, in many parts of Europe, Brazil, India, and so on. And so in the Middle East context, we can see it as part of a global phenomenon, but of course, it's very much also been shaped by the specific events of the past decade. And so on the other side of this sort of divide, we see the forces promoting change of some kind. Again, whether we see it as democratic, popular, revolutionary, or reformist, that they've seen their views discredited, like at no other point in time. Even someone like Abdel Nasser, for instance, who we might think of as promoting Nasserism at the expense of popular rule, still relied heavily on populism, even as he was sort of denigrating democracy. And so that's something that I think in this case, it's rare to see people actually upholding authoritarianism, sort of on its own face. And I think one thing that gets lost and which wasn't really communicated well during the height of the revolutions is the idea that, during those transitions, whether in Tunis or even the brief short-lived transition in Egypt or Yemen or Libya, that the reliance on authoritarian structures is very much intentional, right? That they built in this dependency on the part of the population. And so the cost for any kind of radical change is much higher. And I think that this was not communicated well by any of those transitional governments, because in the end, of course, you find that people have regretted those kinds of changes. And they've, as such, based on the fact that these authoritarian systems tend to raise the costs for any kind of a change. And so I think this is at least one area where the narrative or the tension between authoritarianism and popular or representative rule is playing out. And the second one, which I'll mention very briefly just for time, is the tension between Islamism and state Islam. For most of its history, Islamism was very much monopolized the discourse on faith-based activism or initiative, because they only really had to compete with the perceived foreign ideologies, whether nationalism or Marxism. And so early attempts to co-opt Islam by the state were not particularly effective. I mean, we can think of someone like Anwar al-Sadat, for instance, who tried to kind of transform himself into a kind of religious figure, or at least someone who used some instruments of religion in the state, but it was not particularly one that resonated very deeply. But I think what we're seeing now is a much more serious attempt to undermine activist Islam through these kinds of interpretations that center on state support and co-optation of existing religious institutions. And we see it, of course, through the UAE sponsorship of this forum on promoting peace in Muslim societies. We see it in terms of the close-knit control and the unprecedented level of control by the Sisi regime and Al-Azhar, as well as the kind of broader mosque institutions within Egypt. We see it in terms of the Saudi ruling establishment, which has finally ended this sort of, almost century-long debate about sort of what role does the religious authorities within Saudi Arabia play, and whether there was a kind of a delicate balance between the ruling family and these religious authorities, which of course now has very heavily tipped in favor of Mohammed bin Salman and sort of the new ruling elite that's being established in the new ruling order. And I think it's really important to think that I think Islamists have not really offered much of a coherent response to the way that state Islam is being manifested in terms of the kinds of messaging it's offering as a very quietist version of Islam, one that is very much supportive of existing rulers, supporting of authoritarianism, even going so far now as to support the normalization efforts between various Arab states and Israel. And so I think in that regard, this is going to be certainly one area that we have to start seeing kind of more of a responsive discourse in the years to come. And I'll just leave it there for now.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for all our 5 speakers for their opening statements. This has really been excellent start. I would like to explain basically the format of today's conversation. We're going to split it into 5 different segments. We're short on time, so we'll try to restrict each segment about 15 minutes or so. The first segment would be the future of the Arab Spring and Islamic movements in the Middle East. The second would be on the status and future of political authority and systems in the Islamic world. The third would be on the Islamic world and great power politics, particularly with respect to the great powers, US, China, Russia, so on. The fourth would be on Islamophobia and the state of Muslim communities in the West and minorities in other places. And finally, the last segment on major challenges facing the Islamic world in the next 20 years. To get through all this is very obviously loaded agenda, is requesting that the answers be within about 90 seconds so we can get to as many questions as possible. So let me start now and turn to the first segment, which was touched upon by several of our speakers concerning the Arab Spring. And my first question is to Heba. Heba was there when this thing happened, 2011, 2012, 2013, and so on and so forth. Something that is very perplexing, watching what happened in January and February of 2011, and what happened afterwards. It looks like we have two different populations, two different people. I've always had that question in the back of my mind: what happened to the Egyptian people? Is there, I'd like to ask many whys in today. Is this just a collective amnesia? What happened? Or is this something much more powerful at play here? Perhaps you can enlighten us.
I think number one, the use of force. I mean, there is an excessive use of force to face any attempt of opposition, even peaceful demonstrations. And there has been very, very clear use of force, not only in the city, but also in villages. And we have different cases where villages have been encirculated by the police forces. And in some cases, food and supplies were cut for a few days till they managed to sort of control the territories that they claimed are basically organized or where there is an influence of the opposition, mainly the Muslim Brothers. And this has not been in the media very much, how the excessive use of force, arrests, executions. So what do you expect? There is a degree of spread of fear as well. And on the other hand, there is a facade of democracy. I mean, everyone who knows comparative politics and knows how elections have been conducted and the changes in the constitution, etc., would definitely realize that there is so much a facade of democracy that the regime was very keen to protect and to promote. But at the same time, the other side of the coin is great violations of human rights and excessive use of force in the civil sphere. So, and then at the end of the day, to answer questions from another side, the Egyptian people did not change. Who is representing the Egyptian people? Is it the official media that is completely and solely controlled by the sovereign entities in the country? Or is it the voices of people on social media and youth, where you find a lot of criticism and a lot of...
I'm looking at this moment of unity that took place, in Tahrir Square. And
this is also something that people would need to look into. I mean, there was there was a degree of unity in the square by those who shared the same cause, but there were so many million people around who did not participate, who were just watching. So
more sinister at play, as how the whether it's the military or perhaps other forces, foreign or domestic, they tried to manipulate those who were on the side of change, revolution, and that they were able to split them, and that was a major fault line. And then among the elite, what is very strange is the Egyptian people themselves, how they pulled out from these forces and became, in a sense, distraught. What do you think?
Yeah, because I think that everyone was feeling that that they have to go to the political sphere, and actually different aspects of the social development and of different initiatives on the ground, and even correcting some notions of Islam and using the opportunity of more lenient security policies 2011, 2012. Nobody gave attention to these potential spaces, and everyone basically became over politicized, and this disenchanted a lot of people. And of course, there was a stigmatization and also tarnishing of reputation of the activists from all backgrounds by the regime. The media was acting very actively to tarnish the image of those who were trying to achieve change. But also there was a lot of competition. The opposition, Islamists and non-Islamists, basically did not manage to reach a sort of strategy. And there was a lot of contestation. I think that one of the reasons is that people were not ready, and always when people say, but the Muslim Brothers were not ready for this sweeping, victory of this action of the Arab Spring. It's like, you have been there for 80 years. What do you mean you are not ready? So there was a degree of romanticization. Once people go to the streets, the regime will simply collapse, without bearing in mind that the military has been actually in the seat of power, but behind the facade for so many years. So I think that there are such bitter lessons that had to be learned. And actually, on the other side, I see a lot of hope. And I know that things look gloomy and not very promising on one level, but on the other level, because I always deal with young people, I think that to a great extent, this very difficult time taught the younger generation of Islamists, but also other activists, a lot of lessons as well. And I have a lot of hope in the new generation. It brought many of them outside the country to realize that the world is big and the challenges are many, and they have to reconsider the way they used to think about Islam and to think about Islamism as well. And I know that it's not clear yet, but I can see in the future a lot of insights coming from the younger generation, and let's say the middle-aged generation that is now like at the beginning of their 30s, maybe the mid of their 30s. And I expect something to come out of that. A lot of attention has been given to media, a lot of attention has been given to cinema, a lot of attention has been given to intellectual endeavors and courses on whatever you can think of, including going back and studying Islam the very traditional way, something that mushroomed all across the Arab world. Scholars that have been not invited to any events before, very distinguished scholars of Islamic sciences that are not in the media or anything, have been addressed by many young people in order to organize seminars and online and Zoom meetings, etc. So there is so much going on. I don't see the Arab Spring really has failed in terms of the cultural and social change that it actually drove the Arab cultural and social scene to, even if the political failures have been very bitter.
Okay, thank you. John, you were in Washington observing, knowing what we know now, especially after the different books that came about the Obama administration. What do you think happened also in Washington? Was this just they're playing for time to quiet people down, and then ally themselves with these counter-revolutionary forces, or is there something more at play here? Why the turnaround, against the popular expression of sovereignty and democracy, or did they just give up too early? What do you think happened?
Well, I think if you really look realistically at American history and politics, the fact is, even when we had presidents and we thought that they were fairly progressive, at the end of the day, the conventional wisdom, which all of them wound up inheriting and living by, was that the safest, if you were going to want to deal in terms of national interest, was to deal with authoritarian regimes, that they had the power, the control, and they had the elites, and they bought into the line that the Brotherhood or any Islamist group, you couldn't count on them. And I can remember a time when within a particular 2 weeks, you had a prime minister of Turkey, you had Mubarak and somebody else coming separately. And the message from each of them was, you can count on us. And the problem is those Islamists. Now, when the Arab Spring actually came, you would find in the same week, the president of the United States, on the one hand, making a statement, and the Secretary of State another. But they were walking on both sides of the street. One would say, we support the people in the street. The other would say, Mr. Mubarak was a great, colleague to work with. And at the end of the day, what we know is even somebody like Obama refused to say that a coup was a coup was a coup. Okay, so he backed off. And the EU is a little bit more aggressive, but even there, within a short period of time, they've all gone back to, to their standards, as it were. The question now is, and Trump, of course, has gone off the deep end when it comes to dealing with the Middle East, the Palestinians, everything's up for sale. In fact, I was just talking, I was on another webinar the other day, and someone said, who is, I think, from Lebanon, but had worked in the US, he said, it seems to me now the Trump administration in the next few weeks, what we're going to see is what happens in America when there's a fire sale, when a company's going out and they say everything's up for buying at a good price.
So what do you think is going to happen with Biden? Anything? Do you expect anything to happen at all in terms?
I expect Biden is somebody who is very concerned about human rights. There's no doubt about that. He's, to step back just a little, after 9/11, Rami Khoury and I were invited to meet with then the head of the Foreign Relations Committee, Biden. And he was very sharp and very bright and very honest and said, you know, I know Europe really well, particularly France and Germany, but I really don't know the Middle East. I haven't followed it. Like many senators at that point that I did some consulting with, they would say that they relied on their staff.
What year was this?
This would have been exactly right at 9/11, right at that time. And many of them said that, you know, that they relied on their staff, that in fact they had their own little areas, but that they needed now to become more serious about it. He is more serious about the Middle East, but I think there's some things that again become a problem. Being a child of this trajectory within our foreign policy, including with regard to Israel, okay, Biden was always very strong when he was with Netanyahu, unlike Obama, who in the first part of Obama's administration, where he was really pushing back, you know, but at the end of the day, you have Biden on tape saying, you know, not light won't pass between the United States and, you know, et cetera. And so that really strong. I'm a total friend of Israel. He has more recently, he did a clip. It hasn't gotten a lot of circulation, in which he did talk about, and of course it was tied into the elections, you know, the need to understand the Middle East better, that our schools should really be doing more in studying, you know, Islam, and a concern about human rights, a concern about Islamophobia. He's going to end the Muslim ban. But we have to see, his Secretary of State is a very talented diplomat, but he's somebody with a track record of being both personally and politically very strong about Israel. I certainly think it'll be a heck of a lot better than you know, than what we had, but we still can't be sure in terms of, you know, where it'll turn, where it'll come down.
Well, we're going to get later on Islamophobia. I know you've been doing terrific work there. Abdullah, let's take a broader view of the region as a whole. I was struck by that Guardian article, actually. So if you, again, looking back, what do you think happened, the disappointment? Do you think these are external or internal factors, a combination of which, and what is the way out as you read the region?
I mean, I think certainly there is a sense of despair with the failure of revolutions as kind of a method or an approach for change that hasn't been fully articulated, because obviously the people who are mostly pushing this discourse are the counter-revolutionaries themselves. And so the internal critiques have been few and far between. But I do think that there is an important need for people to really dissect and maybe perform a kind of autopsy of sort of what went wrong with the transitions, part of which I think was the lack of commitment to a true revolutionary path. I mean, what we saw is something Asif Bayat, I think, was the one who coined this term of revolutions, with the reform and revolution sort of combined in a way where we didn't necessarily see a true commitment to dismantling the institutions of the former state, because you have to have a real appetite for that. I mean, that's something that does lead to tremendous amount of upheaval, of the loss of certain kind of patronage networks, of the kind of cemented economic, especially and class and social benefits that a lot of you know, citizenry and different classes within society tend to benefit from, without much to replace them, at least in the interim. And especially given the lack of international support, both we saw the kind of economic warfare that was waged on all the revolutionary countries, especially by Gulf regimes. But then even beyond that, when we think of, for instance, how easily the Sisi regime is gaining international credits and loans from international financial institutions, and how difficult it's been for the Tunisians to get the same exact thing as supposedly the one successful democratic transition has been really hit hard by these same factors.
Very quickly,
so I think, yeah.
Because of the time again, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood is not a revolutionary movement, it's a revolutionary movement. You studied it all your life. Do you think they've learned anything from what you see?
Well, I think, I mean, what I would say in terms of even the categorization that you have for this specific section about sort of the future of the Arab Spring and Islamist movements is that these are two entities that maybe overlapped briefly, but we shouldn't see them as coinciding. I think Islamist movements historically were reform-minded, not revolutionaries. And this was partly ideological, but partly also as a means for their survival, that they had to, as a political calculation, make the strong determination that they were going to only focus on working as a reformist movement within the boundaries of the existing state structure. So when they were confronted with a revolutionary opening, they really didn't know what to do. They didn't have those kinds of credentials. Certainly they were most organized to win elections, but they were not the best suited to transition away from the existing power structures. And now I think what you're seeing is you have a massive disarray with what's left of these movements. On the one hand, you have some components of it, particularly the senior leadership, most of whom are either in exile or in prison, who believe in going back to the original mission. Let's just go back to being reformists. Let's focus on our roots, on our dawah, on our grassroots membership, and finding some accommodation with the regime now that looks something like what they had under Mubarak. I mean, this is for them the best case scenario. And then on the other hand, you do have a contingent largely of kind of middle ranking members of youth, especially, who are much more committed now that that revolutionary door sort of cracked open. They want to blow it open and say, we have to go completely revolutionary. And I think that this is the other trend. And those trends have been both competing with one another. They've been dialoguing publicly on social media, in international media forums and things along these lines. It's unclear so far which one is going to really take the ascendancy in the years to come. I think partly it might be dictated based on opportunity, based on what the Sisi regime might do in the case of Egypt, in terms of whether it's going to actually provide an opening for reintegrating these movements, which I don't particularly see that happening anytime soon. I mean, Sisi can't even handle, any opposition from within his own ruling establishment, let alone bringing in an outsider movement that he's declared to be sort of persona non grata in the form of the Brotherhood. So I think in that sense, you're going to see this continued stalemate between these two forces within the Islamist movement.
Can I comment?
Of course.
On Abdullah?
Yes.
I think that it's important to bring the notion of the da'wah that he mentions into the discussion, because what happened to the da'wah 2011 till 2013? It's like if these movements claimed that they are reforming Islam in order to change and reclaim the caliphate at one point, or Islamic Nahda at another point, this was a vehicle, the political was a vehicle for serving the da'wah and the ummah, but the political became the priority. And the notion of when he said, and go back to the da'wah, what da'wah? Seriously? People were not giving da'wah attention after the Arab Spring. So I think this is the biggest challenge, what type of da'wah, because through the da'wah, they managed to get the hearts of people. And through the da'wah, there was a political mobilization. But when you became too over-politicized, you lost this. So you were deemed to basically
the complete transformation in Tunisia from even being an Islamic movement encompassing all different aspects into purely political party. It's even
this is a real challenge, because eventually, Islamism did not promise people heaven on earth, and if it did, then it was mistaken. It's like you promise people dignity. You don't promise people what capitalism can offer them, what commodification can offer them, what an open market can offer them. You offer them dignity, right, and then they have to go a long way of independence. But if you lose the trust of people, and if you focus on politics, others can be much more efficient than you, by the way.
And better financed. All right.
Of course. So it's a challenge. I know that, Professor Ismail mentioned, it's about real politics. It's like we have to start with what we have at hand. But actually, this is also a challenge, because if you start with what you have at hand, you lower very much your ceiling, and you are absorbed into the pragmatic calculations, and then you end up being loser as well, because you are considered to be just pragmatic secularist, and there is no such big difference. And then you make different alliances that do not really reflect where you started from. So it's a challenge.
Thank you very much.
Thank
you very much, Dr. Heba. I want to bring Professor Hamid into this discussion. I think it might be an exaggeration, but I'll go ahead and do it in order to provoke your response. After 1979, the Arab Spring, and especially Syria, might have been one of the largest ideological blows to the Iranian regime in terms of its commitments towards the Ummah and the Muslim world. It was a very stark dividing line So I'd like to ask you, what was I mean, first of all, could you walk us through a brief overview of the calculation that Tehran was undergoing at that moment? But then more importantly, how is this going to move forward in the future? Because we saw this reemerge during Qasim Soleimani's death. Another, people were unable to sympathize with Iran in the face of what was an obvious act of aggression on the part of the Americans, where they assassinated Qasim Soleimani in the open, and it was mainly because of his role in Syria. So, could you please walk us through that? Could you please shed some light?
I'll try my best. So I would say to understand Iranian calculations in this regard, we really have to look at the circumstances Iran is facing. Since the 2006 33-day war between Israel and Hezbollah, Iran feels that it is under serious American pressure, and this is military pressure, it's economic pressure, it's diplomatic pressure. There's also issues of espionage and even assassinations. Today that we're talking together, Iran is under immense pressure. Regarding fighting the coronavirus, for example, Iran hasn't been even able to import influenza vaccines. They bought like 5 million doses and they haven't been able to import them. Even the software that we're talking right now, Zoom, I have to use a VPN just to be able to download it, because it actually says that under American sanctions, you're not able to download the software. Just to give you an idea of how Iranians are living today. And also at the same time, Iran feels that it is strategically isolated. So it has very few allies in the region, the only dependable ones being the Syrian government of Assad, as well as Hezbollah and maybe some militia groups. Other than that, Iran feels that it cannot really rely on other Muslim countries. And one example of that is that when Donald Trump came out and said that he's going to sanction Iranian oil selling, a lot of Muslim countries initially said that they will help Iran, but when the day came, they weren't able to do so. So under those circumstances, Iran feels that if it really backs down from the regions of the Middle East where it has influence, then that is going to cause a domino effect, essentially leading from either Lebanon and Syria to fighting in Iran. One famous quote by Ayatollah Khamenei during Iran's involvement in Syria was that if Iran doesn't fight in Syria, then we have to fight in Hamadan and Shiraz, which are Iranian cities. So the Iranians really feel that they have no choice other than to, push back rather on what they see essentially as Israeli and US plans. So I'm not an expert on Syrian internal affairs, but essentially I'm trying to give you a picture of how the decision-making worked in Tehran.
Moving forward, I wanted to ask you, what does Iran see how itself in the Middle East? What do you see the role of of Iran in the coming few years as we move into the Biden administration, as we see a certain kind of aggressive Israeli stance against the Palestinians and the Gulf Alliance that's coming up? What are your comments about Iran in the Middle East?
So I would say the major issue in Iranian foreign policy in the Middle East is Israel. Israel is seen both as an ideological enemy as well as a strategic rival. And Iran believes that it's the leader of the so-called resistance group, resistance being groups that resist Israel's power and Israel's aggression. And in that regard, that has really much complicated Iran's relationship with the United States. I mean, Iran's relationship with the US was never good to begin with after the revolution. But in the recent past decade, I would say, especially in the past decade, the Israelis have worked very much to complicate any form of rapprochement between Iran and the United States. And a prime example of that were the activities of Benjamin Netanyahu during the Obama administration. So with Biden coming into power, he and his team have repeatedly said that they want to return to the JCPOA. Nevertheless, we're already hearing that the Israelis as well as the Saudis are working behind the scenes for this to never to work, and they are trying to complicate the matter. So I think it's going to be a complicated scene moving forward.
Thank you very much. Finally, I want to ask Professor Ismail. So recently I read an article in the Wall Street Journal where it said Erdogan's choice, the West or sanctions. And I would have to, if I was to mark a time where the tensions between Turkey and the United States really went on a downward spiral, is the Arab Spring. The choice of Turkey to choose and take an existential position vis-a-vis the Arab Spring. This choice has led to a number of expending a number of Turkey's political capital. So, I would like to hear your comments about Turkey's objectives in the region after the Arab Spring and in the neighborhood that it finds itself.
In the if you look at the Turkish foreign policy toward the Middle East up until 2000s, there was this traditional policy of not being too much involved in the Middle East. With the establishment of the Republic, there was already this idea that we are a European nation, we are a wannabe European nation, and there was the sad memories of the First World War, Arab revolt at the time, not uprising. There was an ideological position toward not being too much involved. Of course, there was Cento, there was Baghdad Pact, there was some sort of relationship, but the focus was not the Middle East. It was in 1999, Turkey and Syria basically came to the brink of war over Abdullah Öcalan's, being positioned within Syria. But when this government came to power, it basically, in some ways, continued that policy line, but also had a very strong comeback to the Middle East. And there was this idea that Turkey had to be good with neighbors, the famous zero problems with neighbors policy. And Syria was really the center stage of that. Turkish-Syrian relations in the course of, say from 2003 to 2008, 2009, day by day came quite close. There was this building of trust between the two governing leaders, basically, and their governments. So much so that Turkey and Syria actually came to hold common cabinet meetings twice a year. People in Turkey started talking about the Turkish-Syrian border being no longer meaningful. The trade between Turkey and Syria deepened. A lot of people did business in Syria. Syrians came to Turkey. There was already deep social relationships. Part of the families in the southern eastern part of Turkey, some families are divided between Syria and Turkey. When the Arab Spring started, the Turkish-Syrian relations, more specifically, was at its best. And Turkey was somehow looked upon in the Middle East, in general, in the Arab Middle East, basically as this country that has for so long basically turned its back to the Middle East, but a Muslim majority country, now a conservative, a sort of Islamist government is now both doing well with European Union and also turning not its back but its face to the Middle East. And when the Arab Spring started, there was almost a euphoric moment. I was in Egypt at the time in 2010, 2011. I personally saw the kind of support, what it meant, what Turkey meant to the people, and not just Islamists. I attended a meeting where very important secularist politicians and intellectuals were basically complaining to Erdogan about the Islamist parties in Egypt, almost saying like, say something to these people. How did you do it in Turkey? This was always the question I faced when I was in Egypt at the time. How did you do it, and all that? But and actually, if you look at the international media and political pundits, Turkey was singled out as the winner of the Arab Spring, almost, because of this democratic ideology, because basically Turkey was not in the business of democracy promotion, but its identity as a struggling democracy, at least having a strengthened democratic institution in Turkey, was appealing to the people in the street in the Arab world, to the intellectuals, to the public in general. But when Arab Spring turned violent in Syria, most importantly again, now that was a very hard choice for Turkey, and of course it's spiraled, it's prolonged, and that we came to the brink of war with Syria in 1999. We were talking about being two states with one single nation in 2009, 2010. It was such a close relationship between Syria and Turkey. But now in 2019, we are almost in an undeclared war with the Syrian regime. So whether this is the turning point with Turkish relations deteriorating with the United States, I'm not exactly sure. Actually, at some point, the Americans even saw Turkish influence in the region as an asset. And there was at least some policy people that were thinking in those lines. But Turkey was also following a foreign policy that was not completely in line with the United States. So there was this tension building, and that's why I think the breaking point is not the Arab Spring, but the July 15 coup attempt in Turkey. It was really that time that people said, you can see it in the internal coalition shifts and alliance shifts in the ruling party. For example, right now the ruling party is coalescing with two secular nationalist parties. One of them is basically arguing for a Russian imperial expansion as being the only solution to American imperialism. And this is now a part of the governing coalition in Turkey. So I think July 15 had much more deeper impact on the worsening of the relations. That's why Turkey shifted from Turkish-American relations were already not good, but that became the breaking point, and Turkey had a very close rapprochement with Russia afterwards. Actually, in November 2015, Turkey shut down a Russian jet. And in the December of 2015, people were thinking about what would it be like to be in a war with Russia. But a few months after, in July 2016, the coup attempt happened. And the Turkish officials saw it as being basically cooked up in United States because of Fethullah Gülen's presence in Pennsylvania. And then the relations deteriorated afterwards. And I think Qatar is basically building on that. Then Turkey became close with Russia in terms of defense cooperation as a NATO ally, as a quote-unquote strategic ally with the United States. And of course, it didn't bode well with relations. And now we ended up in the Qatar sanctions.
Thank you very much. That was a lively discussion. I think we should move on for the sake of time. The next topic that we wanted to touch on was the status and future of political authority and systems in the Muslim world. And here I want to raise the question, something that we've been talking about is, and was raised by Professor Mamdani at the beginning of the conference, and it's been a theme throughout, which is the question of the nation state. I mean, political authority as we know it is grounded in democratization. It's grounded in a sense of the demos, the nation. Are there any models on the horizon for grounding political authority that can in some way break the nation state? I mean, if you take Donald Trump as a moment of authoritarian revival, as culminating in and globally of authoritarian revival, it seems like the Arab Spring came at the end of a long period of globalization. So my question is, was the Arab Spring and the movements of democratization a product of globalization, or were there other forces at work? Or is an authoritarian model more of the future that we're going to go for? So I'll first like to ask, Professor Ismail, while he's has the floor, because he talked about nationalism and nation state.
Starting with the second part of your question, whether Arab Spring was a result of globalization. Actually, I would reply to that question in a positive way, because I happen to think that much of the material infrastructure was laid down by the forces of globalization. And as we all know, in the Arab globalization took the form of crony capitalism, where a shift from a big state, an expanded state, became privatized, and these were basically sold out to the cronies of the regimes. So a small clique got very rich, but because of the pressures of neoliberalism, because of the cutting subsidies to social services, because of the shrinking of the state and the attendant loss of employment, a rise of unemployment in society. We have seen, for example, hundreds of riots in Egypt prior to the Arab Spring, actually, prior to the fall of Mubarak. They were small protests, but some of them were bread riots, or small labor groups coming together and protesting. We all are focused on the Tahrir protest, January 25th. But actually before that, there is literally hundreds of protests that the Minister of Interior, Egyptian Minister of Interior, has recorded, actually, that laid down the path for basically culminated in the Tahrir protests. So in a perverse way, globalization through crony capitalism laid down the political economic basis of the Arab Spring. As for the first part of your question, Owais, the nation state form is a very stubborn form, but it is a historical form. Maybe you look at, for example, feudalism as a historical form. Takes 1,000 years, lives for 1,000 years, but dies at some point. I'm always struck by Hans Morgenthau's thinking on this. Hans Morgenthau, being a foremost realist figure in international political thinking, a very state-centric thinker, still says the nation state as it is cannot continue. So because these are historical artifacts, through interactions, this form will change. It cannot continue as it is. It will either expand in the form of empires, or it will either basically fall into itself and take the form of what is called neo-medievalism, like basically small statelets and all that. But to me, the most important thing about the political authority structures in the Muslim world, especially in the MENA region, is the fate of what is called the authoritarian bargain. Because when we look at the Middle East, what we see is that there is a tacit, sometimes an overt, a bargain, a social contract between the elites, between the regimes and the people. These rentier states who are not reliant on the tax base of the citizens, they basically provide services, health services, education services, or other infrastructural services and security, basically as a gift to people. Then in return, basically brings us to the famous idea of the relationship between taxation and representation. So the authoritarian bargain in the Arab Middle East, especially more so in the Gulf, was that I provide you with the basics, with a modicum of security, with some wealth through the oil money and natural gas money, and you basically remain silent. This was the deal with the citizenry, and this was basically working because of the heavy hand of the state repressing, because of the lack of mobilization, all sorts of reasons. But the big question for me is what is going to happen to this authoritarian bargain when we see the decline of the oil economy. People already talk about the post-oil economics. We see, for example, GCC countries cutting subsidies to water and energy sources. We see the Saudi Arabia and other countries basically struggling to find new renewable energy sources. Or the famous MBS vision for 2030. All these kinds of things are basically attempts to respond to the post-oil situation. And I wonder what is going, I think the big question for me is this: what is going to happen to this authoritarian bargain in the Middle East once the state can no longer provide its share of the promises? Because of declining oil resources, oil revenues. I think this is, to me, an important point to look at on this question.
Thank you very much. Professor Abdullah, I wanted to pull you in. You spoke a little bit about, these young student of yours who were going through a moment of disenchantment after the Arab Spring. And it reminded me of what happened to French intellectuals after '68, in the sense that French intellectuals thought they were living in a democracy, and they thought they had the right to expression. But the French state came down very hard on their expression of political will. So are we living through a similar disenchantment with democracy? I mean, or democratic aspirations? And why should we be convinced that democracy is still the right road forward?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I mean, I think on the one hand, certainly there is that disenchantment, probably just based on a mixed, to put it generously, track record, right? That we haven't seen the fruits as they were promised. I mean, when we think about what the people were chanting, it was not democracy per se. It was the ends of democracy, right? It was bread, freedom, social justice. It was the things that democracy was meant to produce. But once it became an end in and of itself, especially as part of post-authoritarian transitions that were not necessarily, dismantling those institutions that came before, I think that there was a disillusionment with the idea that the elections was supposed to be the outcome, right? And we saw far too much celebration. I mean, it reminded me in some ways of the images out of Iraq post 2003, when you had the pictures of people with the ink on their fingers. And so, even with the presence of American tanks and the killings in Fallujah and elsewhere, somehow just the fact that Iraqis were holding elections was seen as some sort of arrival of Arab societies or something. And at the time that was rightly discredited, and yet we didn't do the same when we saw the elections that were taking place in 2011, 2012, and so forth, where people had to kind of see beyond. But what I would say to that as well is, looking back at some of the points I made about the authoritarian promise, is that none of those have actually delivered, right? When we look at the state of security, when we look at the state of the economic prosperity that was promised, all the things that justified the military coup in Egypt, all of the things that continue to justify the interventions in Yemen and Libya and Syria, have not actually come to fruition. And in that sense, I think the longer that people tend to perceive what Dr. Ismail just mentioned, as far as this authoritarian ruling bargain and its failures, I think that there will be an opening to explore the possibility of a kind of democratic alternative, especially as these states are shirking from their responsibilities, right? That they're not actually fulfilling any of the promise. I mean, when one thinks, for instance, again, just Egypt, because I know it best, the fact that the Sisi regime has not followed even the most basic fundamental rules of establishing a stable authoritarian regime. He's not built a mass party. to incorporate people and establish patronage networks directly within society, the way the NDP served for decades. He's not even consolidated the oligarch class. He's alienated many of them. He's not consolidated control within the military. He's really just appointed family members and a few close confidants, to the point where you even have reports of disaffection within the army. So the idea that he's not following many of the most basic fundamental rules of what required, and he's relied so much on sheer force, right? And again, this is sort of classic authoritarianism. A weak authoritarian state is one that needs violence. A strong one actually only needs the threat of violence, but doesn't ever actually have to employ it. And so the fact that this many years later, we're still seeing the outburst of violence by the state shows, in fact, tremendous instability, weakness, insecurity internally in terms of its ability to sustain itself. And I think all of those on one level have to be seen as promise for the idea that there can be some kind of opening for change, if not in the short term, at least in the medium to long term. And so that's what I would say, is at least. And so if that's what we're seeing in Egypt, imagine what we have to expect in Libya should Haftar emerge, or in Yemen should, you know, the authoritarians that are being backed by the Saudis emerge victorious. And I think that's something to sort of keep an eye on elsewhere as well.
One final question I want to ask Dr. Heba. So you said, you know, I thought that what you meant by the pragmatic compromises with the that ends up turning political parties, Islamist political parties, into just another secular liberal force. Is there any future? I mean, one way to read the lessons from the Arab Spring is that, no, listen, we had a moment of genuine secular coalescence between Islamists and non-Islamists around forces of authoritarianism. Another way to read it is, look, man, we have to go our own way. You know, we have to double down on the Islamic ideology. We have to double down on the dawah. We have to double down on the question of Islamic law and Islamic principles of law. Which way do we go forward? I mean, is there any room for a future of Islamic governance and Islamic political authority, or do we just play the democratization AKP style? Dr. Heba, I can't hear you. Is it because of me, or are you on the English channel? Oh, there you go.
So can you hear me? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
There has been debates about popular sovereignty in Islamic perspective. I mean, you are working on some of these dimensions. So I think that the problem is that eventually the Islamic movements are getting, once they get into power, they get disconnected from the masses. And somehow, and this has been said, actually, and the experience I had was very complicated, that we were told all the time when we were critical about the way they ran issues, especially after the election of President Morsi, that you don't know what's going on inside the machine of politics. It's more difficult than you can imagine. You know, it's okay, fine, great, good luck then. You know, they started disconnecting themselves from the masses, and they're accusing people who are on the street, trying actually indirectly to support them by having exercising opposition on the street, that they are thugs. You know, of course they were thugs on the street, but they were also activists. So I think it's a challenge. But on the other hand, coming back to your question of the Westphalian state, and I loved what Ismail mentioned regarding Westphalia, the love of the Westphalian model. It's very interesting that my question is now, we have been for long talking about globalization and its impact on sovereignty, and the differentiation that Zygmunt Bauman calls between politics and policy, between power and politics. You know, that you exercise the administration and bureaucratic everyday business inside, but you don't have the political decision, really, because of you are just you're not the center, you are the margin in a way, and back to the old dependency theory, etc. But we are moving actually towards something that we cannot see at the moment. Nobody was seeing the nation state rising when it happened at that time. You know, we could only see it coming and emerging in the 19th century, basically. I mean, since the 17th century, it was on its way in a way. So the emergence itself is very complicated. So I think now that one of the aspects that I started with at the very beginning of our talk, when I mentioned the civil-military relations and how the civil affects very much the military affects the civil, is that we have a new dimension now in the civil-military relations, or basically in the relations of politics, that regular armies are cooperating with mercenaries. And at one point, I started asking myself, in the case of the United Arab Emirates, for example, who is using whom? So it's like, is it the United Arab Emirates that is using the Blackwater, or is it Blackwater that is using the United Arab Emirates? That this is a question. Because I think that with the power that is given to the Blackwater and the experience in war machine in Iraq and other places, and with all that connection at the end of the day with regular armies, the regular army of the United States. I mean, do you think that the United Arab Emirates really is using Blackwater? I think it is trying to figure out, are these arm deals done by states really, or this is what the mercenaries asked for to be equipped with, but they cannot buy them on their own. They need the states to buy, and then they will be using them under the umbrella of the state, and who is more powerful than the other? This is a new component in the modern sovereignty realm of the military action of regular armies. And I think that this will be one of the most important changes that we will witness in the future. And then this poses the question: if the companies of that providing security and military services will go very big, and they have been actually in Africa and West Africa for a long time. Mercenaries have been affecting making the coups and changing the economic situation, etc. Then what type of sovereign state are we going to witness in the future? And this is in the making. An additional dimension, like the elites cannot separate themselves eventually from, actually the elites can separate themselves. You have now a segregation, urban segregation between the different groups taking part in different countries. And if you are talking about the rentier state, I mean, this can be run from outside. I mean, who knows where the rulers of Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates are? At the end of the day, they can simply be not in the country in the first place. That they're running it with a remote control and using heavily more and more, especially in Saudi Arabia, the influence of Blackwater again. And there has been different instances that highlighted that, though the things are not as blunt as they are in the United Arab Emirates. So what type of nation state are we talking about now, when the backbone, the sovereign backbone, which is the military, is now engaged in cooperation with mercenaries and not private military corporation? I will call them mercenaries, to bring us back to the medieval components of this, and back to Machiavelli, basically. So we are in a very sensitive moment, and we should foresee what is going on and its implications in the future, because I think that the nation state is changing a lot. And it's not about globalization. It's not about the checks and balances. It's about an essential change in the nature of what we knew so far as the nation state.
If I could just make a point, I think Mamdani in his talk referred to actually his new book, which I suggest you get. You can get it pretty quickly. That Muslim countries need to think beyond the nation state. But I think in the short term, one of the realities you have in the MENA region is, you don't really have nation states. I mean, the UAE and Saudi Arabia are family-owned states, family-owned countries. I mean, it's the family, that owns the country, and the level of resources that they've had that may disappear. But right now, certainly the UAE and others and Saudi Arabia have the resources to be both very authoritarian and also to wind up being attractive to Western governments, because the Western governments that normally represent a different model, supposedly, of a democratic national state, what we find out is that significant Western governments are actually very happy to deal with authoritarian regimes because they feel safer with them. And I think that, part of the issue, as I see it in some countries, including in a place like Egypt, is after you really get defeated the way it occurred, and you have such a repressive government, I think it's certainly there are going to be people who, because of globalization, and particularly I think younger generations, the current one and the one after, that are going to want to see change. But the reality of it is that for many people are concerned with surviving and dealing with that survival, and the lesson that you learn with somebody like Sisi is that you don't step out of line, because what he's shown is that he not only put people in prison that everybody expected him to put into prison, given his politics, but anybody who then would disagree with him on almost anything winds up going to prison. And I think that kind of situation, just as in Algeria, where you've almost got a history of military run states. Now, Sisi may be ignoring a lot of the military, but he does come out of the military, and the military still has a heavy economic investment in the country, let alone the power side. So, I mean, for me, although I'm a very strong advocate and was very upset, if not devastated, by what happened with regard to the Arab Spring, I have a sense that it's going to take quite a few years before we're going to see, significant change taking place. It could take 10 or 20 years unless some miracle happens, because you do have these entrenched sectors and especially also the entrenched elites, which is, it's something that one shouldn't forget. For an awful lot of entrenched elites who are business people, et cetera, if they've got a really lock-on relationship, it's hard to break it up. And I think that's and again, the so-called new powers that are coming in aren't, when it comes to the Western powers, they're very happy with that. I think there'll be some accommodation, some change, but not a lot. If you take a look at, I was going to try to introduce today, but I didn't have enough time. If you take a look at what's going on in France and Austria right now, there is the state is more and more not becoming democratic. Austria and France are moving aggressively to the right. And even France, which is usually seen as liberal, is moving to the right. Macron is moving to the right because he's got a 38% approval rate, and he knows that the right is very strong, and he's attempting to co-opt them by doing what? By moving against the Muslim community in France. Right. So you have an attack that's done by a Chechen who doesn't come with deep roots in the French Muslim community, but that becomes the excuse to then propose laws and put in regulations that are significantly impacting mainstream Muslim countries.
Actually, I want to get into this in segment 4. Now I want to combine segment 2 and 3 and pose a question to you, John. Segment 3 is the Islamic world and great power politics. We were in a unipolar moment right after the collapse of the Soviet Union. We may have passed that, according to many international relations scholars. Now we have a multipolar world, talking about China and to a lesser degree Russia, but a rising China as a global power. And so when you look at this competition now, obviously United States would have different grand strategies whenever they try to promote more liberal hegemony when at the unipolar moment, and now back probably to realpolitik, which means it's going to be more squeeze and more pro-authoritarian regimes. So you might have already answered this, but the question I wanted to ask you had to do you see any glimmer of hope regarding a more democratizing Middle East in light of what we see with MBS and MBZ and Sisi and others, and those who have been very aggressively moving towards not just an authoritarian regime prior to 2011, but even a harsher version of what the people were experiencing. Even now we have even civil wars and failed states and so on and so forth. That would have come at the later segment, but I wanted to ask you particularly about the political authority, the future political systems and authorities. Do you see more authoritarian regimes being there in a multipolar world where you have great power competition, where the US is trying obviously to assert its power more in the Far East and have less, where it gives more free hand for Israel to dictate many of the policies taking place in the region, with these new emerging alliances with dictatorships and authoritarian and with the retreat of the democratic movements? Do you see any hope?
Not much. I mean, let me just note that Freedom House in 2009 was talking about, they were talking about the increase in, it might be that fourth wave. By 2017, they basically said you got a real recession, receding of that reality. And if you look even after that, even more of a receding of that reality. So, you look at, for example, all the things that we didn't expect, that we'd have an American president who would get in bed with the head of North Korea, China, if he could, with the Russians, etc. You have the extent to which the UAE and Saudi Arabia, that were always happy to have kind of a power, but it was the power of the checkbook. As Bandar once said, during the Bosnian War, somebody asked him about the role that Saudi Arabia might play. This was at Central Command. And he said, well, we have a small population, but thank God there's America. We're not blessed the way America is. And so we support America, meaning we'll write the checks, let the American boys fight and die for it. And I think that if you look more recently, I mean, the brilliant part of what they're doing for some, that is for this MBS and MBZ, is that they're doing this cosmetic facade, which people outside just see them as, well, for example, I don't know, most of you haven't seen it, but they have this wonderful video for the UAE now, where they show you that the UAE has 45 Christian churches and is building a huge Jewish synagogue, and that you can get halal and kosher food. And the way they make that work, they say, because they're in a Muslim country, is you build another little unit onto the store. Okay, and they also bring together intellectuals and prominent Islamic scholars and leaders as advisors, and they run a conference on religious pluralism out of Morocco. They basically fund it, and so you got that profile. MBS is very good at we're going to have women drive. At the same time, he arrests major women thinkers and has been holding them for a couple of years in prison, and nobody sees that. He's very effective of dealing with world leaders. I mean, you see the way in which
from Biden and the next administration towards these kind of, he was getting free ride with Trump. Are you going to
you're not going to see I don't think you'll see the free ride. I mean, I don't know how far Biden will go, but
no, he had free ride with Trump. I mean,
I mean, Biden's won't do that. I think Biden has already made it clear. He's made some statements in which he's made it clear that.
But is he going to follow up on it?
That rights will be important. No, I think it will. I think that's been part of Biden's persona as a politician historically, to be concerned about human rights. Where you have a problem, let's say with Biden potentially, is that he is concerned about human rights, but then based on where he was in the past, when he's dealing with Israel and a constituency, he tilts more that way than to the Palestinians. But he's also gone out of his way more recently to talk about the need to respect Palestinian rights. So I think that Biden is going to be a much more open person. He's talked about ending DACA immediately, ending the Muslim ban immediately. And I think there'll be that kind of momentum. But on certain areas, that's going to be the question. I think we'll still want to be doing a business. And in fact, I was kind of really concerned. The other day I was on one of these, whatever we want to call them, virtual discussion groups. And a political scientist who's had a fair amount of influence in governments, and whom I respect, really bright, wound up saying that from a pragmatic reason, he still thought it would be best for the United States to be supporting authoritarian regimes, or to accept them. We don't like it, but to accept them because, as it were, they'd be the best game in town. And I can tell Abdullah that it happens to be a Georgetown faculty member, but I won't go any beyond that.
I'm not surprised. My next questions, two questions actually, are to both Ismail and Hamid, and they are reciprocal of each other. First, to Professor Hamid, I want your comment about how do you see, I know that's not your area of specialty, but now we're almost 40 years after the Islamic Republic was established. I wanted to see, as a political scientist, after 40 years, obviously that's an age of maturity. How do you see that experiment? Is the curve going up or down despite all the pressures? And then the question, and of course, perhaps if our Turkish professor cares to answer the question regarding the AKP after 15 years, how does he see that too? But the question also to both of you, and of course, all that under 3 minutes needs a lecture, but 3 minutes each. If you can, if you care to comment about Turkish-Iranian relations, I was in a meeting with a very important person here in Turkey, and he was talking positively about the relationship, to my surprise. So I wanted to know, do you think that there is some sort of a tacit agreement on some of the policies taking place in the region between the two countries? And could that be a glimmer of hope where they can pull together much of the Islamic world, since the Arab world is a basket case right now? Start with Professor Hamid. Yeah.
Okay, I'll try to be as fast as possible. So with regards to Iran, I think compared to Middle Eastern standards, we do have a relative democracy in Iran. I mean, the presidency is elected, the parliament is elected, even the supreme leader is elected indirectly. Of course, it's not a perfect system and it needs a lot of reforms. But the main issue here, and I think this is the big elephant in the room when we're talking about the nation state or how it evolves or about democracy, is about the issue of foreign intervention and foreign involvement. I mean, you have this notion in the West, which was propagated by the likes of Bernard Lewis, who say that the people in the Middle East, or Arabs or Muslims in general, they always blame either the West, or they blame Sykes-Picot, or they blame Israel for their own problems. And of course, we do have a lot of problems. And of course, I do admit that a lot of those are internal problems. Nevertheless, and I'm sorry to make this crude comparison, but I do make it in my class. The crude comparison is that you're asking an adult who's an alcoholic or who has depression, and you're telling them, well, you have to put these things aside, but you're ignoring the fact that this adult was sexually assaulted when they were a kid. So it did have a very lasting impact on how they evolve today. I mean, listen, the nation state and democracy can only evolve correctly if there is a breathing space and there is an atmosphere where they can evolve. In the United States, slavery was not considered illegal until the 13th Amendment, which only came in 1865. The 19th Amendment only gave voting rights to women until 1920. So for almost 150 years, women couldn't vote. So like even in the American system, it took a lot of time to evolve to get where it is today. Now, the problem in the Middle East and for countries such as Iran is that it does not have that breathing space because of foreign pressure and foreign involvement. And as a result of that, it is not really evolving under normal circumstances. And thus, you cannot explain the same result as, countries such as the United Kingdom or the United States. Should I comment on Iran-Turkey's relationship later or say it very quickly now?
Say it quickly now.
Well, compared to other countries in the region, I think Iran-Turkey's relations are actually quite good. Of course, there's a lot of potential for it getting better, but the big issue being right now in the Middle East, I mean, you have three main sources of power. You have Iran and its allies, Turkey and its allies, and then Saudi Arabia and its allies. So I think Iran's Turkish relations will very much depend on Turkish relations with Saudi Arabia and with the United States on the other hand. So that's why it's complicated.
Interesting. Okay. Ismail?
Okay. So the AK Party experiment in Turkey is, I think, a globally significant experiment for the Muslim world, not just for the Turks here. The party came to power in 2003 and is still in power. We don't have the scenario of Mursi running for 1 year, or Algeria in 1991 where the military intervenes and the Islamists cannot come to power here, or it's not the Sudanese experiment where Islamists come to power through a military coup. This is a party that was established after the Erbakan, Necmettin Erbakan's Islamist party was closed down by the Constitutional Court of Turkey. And this was an ideologically different party from the mainline Islamist party. At the time, this was very hotly debated. There was this division between the hardliners, softliners, the old versus young in the movement. And this was more like a pro-European Union, pro-globalization party at its outset. And basically, AK Party used European Union accession process as an important leverage against the military in Turkey. It was basically a coalition of Islamists, conservatives, moderate nationalists, liberals, and socialists, basically trying to democratize the country. And to do it, the basic way to do it was to cut the power of the military, which the party did successfully. And I think it reached its apex in 2011 when a significant constitutional change was introduced. It was through time that AK Party gained power, solidified itself, basically established itself. At the time, people were talking about whether AK Party would become a hegemonic party like the Liberal Democratic Party of Japan or the party in Mexico. But after 2011, problems started to emerge within the governing elite, within the governing circle, especially with the Gulen movement and the AK Party. That rivalry continued. And when we came to 2013, I take 2013 to be an important turning point, because in May 2013, late May 2013 was the eruption of the Gezi Park protests. And then in December 2013, we have the December 1725 events, as we call it in Turkey, where the Gülenist factions within the government basically attacked the AK Party through allegations of corruption. And there were basically a couple of ministers were taken to custody and all that. There was a fierce battle that didn't recognize any rules at the time. And this, I think, became the turning point in terms of the democratization of the country, because up until, say, 2011, maybe if you push it 2013, AK Party has introduced very significant democratization measures. Of course, there were problems, but all these measures were very significant, opening up measures, more participation, for example, basically giving the properties of the confiscated properties of the religious minorities to them. And this was, I think, a very significant thing to do by an Islamist, a mild Islamist party. But especially after 2016, with the July 15 coup attempt, then the main concern of the AK Party became cleansing what the party calls the government calls the parallel state within state establishment. And of course, democracy, rights, rule of law, all these things took a backseat. Now we see a significant shrinking on that regard. So a proponent of democratic opening up until, say, 2013 is no longer there. Now, AK Party speaks the language of national security. And also we have to think about the international atmosphere. From 2003 up until Arab Spring, we had a relatively stable international atmosphere that helped Turkish foreign policy and Turkish economy. But with the eruption of 4 interlinked civil wars in the region, especially with the rise of PKK, PYD in its borders, then Turkish foreign policy became much more militarized. And then the rights discourse went and was replaced by the security discourse. So this was an important shift. But I think AK Party experiment was significant because an entire literature on Muslim democracy and post-Islamism was basically, this was the poster child of this movement. Islamists, still devout Muslims, but not operating within the confines or coordinates of classical Islamism, and is able to build coalitions with liberals, with seculars, with socialists, with nationalists, and moving country toward a more democratic position. I think the AK Party up until 2011, maybe 2013, was really something to be looked at. That's why a lot of parties were modeled after the AK Party. Actually, the Moroccan AK Party was established before the Turkish AK Party, but there was an Egyptian AK Party established after the dethroning of Mubarak, and we have seen this in other places. So that party became a model, but right now that model status, I think, is not very much there in terms of democratic opening and everything.
Do you see any changes in the horizon?
Again?
Do you see any changes in the horizon since elections are coming 3 years?
Yeah, the thing is, because of the impact of the July 15 coup attempt, now AK Party is a coalition of nationalism. Basically, more Islamic-oriented nationalists, more secular-oriented nationalists, more secular, most secular-oriented nationalists. That's why at least new parties are established in Turkey. Some people suggest that because of, and these parties were basically they broke from AK Party and were established as new parties. Maybe these parties, they developed discourse of development, rule of law and rights and liberties. Maybe that might be a push, but this is up in air. We don't know which direction it will take. And a quick note on the Turkish-Iranian relations. Actually, the Turkish-Iranian border was established in 1630s. I remember what my high school history teacher said, our border with Iran is older than the United States. Mm-hmm. So, and we have not fought a war with Iran, but Turkey and Iran, especially after the Safavid era, have always been in a strategic rivalry. Especially after the Safavid era, there was ideological sectarian differences too. And during the Cold War, Iran and Turkey was competing as to which one is better allied to United States and everything. But the Islamic Revolution was conceived as a threat by the regime in Turkey, by the Kemalist establishment. But the AK Party didn't have that kind of a baggage. It certainly was not looking sympathetically to it. Because it was seeing the Iranian revolution as a sectarian revolution. It turned into a sectarian revolution after the Iran-Iraq war. That's why Iran is not a model in any way to be replicated for the AK Party. And during the Syrian civil war, there was heavy confrontation, not military, but diplomatic, political confrontation between Iran and Turkey. But now it looks like Turkey is getting better, getting along with through Syria, through Russia, also getting along with Iran to find a diplomatic solution, and we have seen that. So that strategic rivalry is there. I'm not exactly sure if the two parties, the two states, are in a position to come together and lead something positive. Because just last week, they exchanged very heavy words over the question of Azerbaijan, for example. In the Azerbaijan-Armenia conflict, Turkey is heavily supporting Azerbaijan, and Iran is almost tacitly supporting Armenia. At least it is what it is seen by Turks here. These kinds of discords or frictions happen and still continue between Iran and Turkey.
Thank you very much. Before we proceed, I would like to indulge our panelists if they can stay with us another 20 minutes. And then we will try to rush through. Owais will start segment 4, and then I'm going to merge segment 5 with the closing statements and give you extra time. All right, Owais.
Yeah, I mean, I want to move on to section 4, but before we do that, I just wanted to ask a quick question to both Ismail, Professor Ismail and Hamid. When I took a class with Kose Balaban, he told us in Turkish foreign policy that actually Turkey and America, as far as great powers are concerned, are natural allies as opposed to Turkey and Russia because of the geostrategic positioning of these countries. And actually the same would apply for Iran and Russia. But Dr. Hamid, I know you've written on this issue. Now with the worsening of ties between Turkey and America, is there any chance that we could see a strengthening of ties between Turkey, Iran, and Russia, which would be actually against geopolitical calculation, an alliance that we would expect? Just very quickly, and then
Okay, I'll try.
Because I have you both here, I want to ask it, and then we can.
I would say that within Iran, there's no consensus on this issue. For example, the point that Ismail pointed out regarding the Azerbaijan-Armenistan war, in Iran, actually, it was understood that Iran is tacitly supporting Azerbaijan. And within Iran, there was actually some criticism of why are we supporting the Azeris? So I think there's no consensus, especially when we talk about Russia, because Iran has a very long history where Russia has actually dominated Iran and has not been fair to Iran. And Iran's original slogan during the revolution was neither East nor West. So the saying goes, and I have colleagues who say that, well, if we want to put the slogan aside and we want to pick a side, then we might as well pick the West. Why should we pick the East? I mean, the West has more money, they're better developed. So Iran-Russia relations is very tricky. With regards to Turkey, I think it's much more doable. Nevertheless, there is a understanding within some segments of Iranian society and elites that see Turkey as trying to become the dominant force in the Middle East, sort of as a new Ottomanism. I'm not saying whether this is accurate or not. I'm just saying that this is what some circles in Iran see, and they actually do criticize Erdogan as a leader. So I think both on the issue of Turkey and on the issue of Russia, there's no consensus. But with regards to Turkey, I think there's a lot of potential for improvement.
Yeah. Turkey and United States have, there's a history to Turkish-American cooperation. Actually, during the Second World War, the Kemalist party, the single party at the time, depending on how Hitler was going during the war, was even contemplating with, basically making gestures that send good signals to Hitler. But once the war was won by the Allied powers, then in 1946, the Turkish single party regime was opened up. There was the first elections, democratic elections happened in 1946, but it wasn't really democratic elections, but at least that was the shift. It was basically just to signal United States that we are clear, that we are on your side. So don't mistake us. We will be in the Western coalition. And actually the real turning point came with Stalin asking Turkey to basically trying to take the straits, both Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits, and also a couple of provinces in the eastern part of Turkey, Kars and Ardahan. Of course, this was, at the beginning and height of the Cold War, this was an incredible fear for the Turkish policymakers. That's why Turkey wanted to be in the Western alliance, in the NATO alliance. Turkey wanted to be in the NATO so badly in order to find a balance in the Cold War, find an ally in the Cold War. That's why Turkey actually got into the Korean War. What has Turkey to do in Korea? But Turkey's, I think 600 soldiers, there were, I think 600 casualties in Turkish military fought in Korea in order to get acceptance to NATO. So Turkey has been in the NATO alliance since 1952 and it still continues. But the fact that Turkey has been part of NATO and has been called a strategic ally with the United States didn't prevent conflicts throughout in the meantime. Famously, 1960s, there was the Johnson letter when Turkey, on the question of Cyprus, basically threatening Turkey, if you engage in military activity in Cyprus, then consequences will follow. So it was very badly received at the time, but still Turkey did that military intervention in 1973. Another turning point came with the collapse of the Soviet Union, because the strategic importance of Turkey was was gone as a bulwark against Russian expansionism. And also with the Gulf War, there emerged the question of a Kurdish state. There was already PKK activities, terrorist activities in Turkey starting in 1982, but 1984. But now there was this serious possibility that a PKK-led state would be established in northern Iraq. And that was a huge tension between Turkey and United States. And that is still, I think, in my opinion, the biggest issue between United States and Turkey on the question of the American support for PYD in Syria, PKK. This is long, and it's even beyond party lines. A lot of parties, all parties are almost on the same line, criticizing the United States on that position.
Forgive me, Professor Ismail, to
Sure.
interrupt you. It's kind of, I know, rude to ask the question and then ask you to sum up very quickly, but the time is running out and we already asked for extension. If you have a few more remarks to make very quickly, I want to move on to the next section.
I think that's pretty much what I of course we can prolong the debate, but I don't want to belabor the point. We can move on to the next topic, maybe.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. With your permission, I'll move on. The next topic that we wanted to cover before we close the session was the issue of Islamophobia and the state of Muslim communities in the West and around the world, something that an ummatic vision should keep in mind. Sometimes we think that the Ummah is Iran, Turkey, Syria, Egypt. But there's a lot more to the Muslim world. We haven't even touched on South Asia, Southeast Asia. We haven't talked about other parts of the Muslim world, but in Africa, East Africa. In any case, I want to ask Professor Esposito and Professor Abdullah, how do they see Islamophobia in the United States? What's the state of the situation with the changing of the guard? Will we see a policy change in the treatment of Muslims in these countries? I also wanted to ask about France. We have the issue of the recent issues about France and Austria. So if I could ask Professor Esposito to talk about France and Austria, I will let Professor Abdullah talk about the US, and we might cover everything.
But let me begin by saying, if you want to follow any of these, go to bridge.georgetown.edu. .georgetown.edu. We have a massive project called the Bridge: Protecting Pluralism, Ending Islamophobia. You'll find all kinds of data of articles and fact sheets. You'll find it fascinating in the fact sheets to see how many members of the Trump administration are basically Islamophobes. So that'll play into that. But if we're talking about Islamophobia more broadly, I think that what we've seen in the last couple of months in France and Austria is something to be very disturbed about. What they share in common is that both are coming around the word political Islam, or using it when it's convenient. And actually so is Belgium. So political Islam becomes a word when you want to say that there's a problem, rather than distinguishing between mainstream political and violent political, as was done back in the first Bush administration, in trying to find a word to talk about Islam and politics and distinguish it from just saying we're not dealing just with Islam, the religion. The word political Islam became more and more into cachet, but they use it in a negative way, and they tie it also into questions, especially the Austrians, of Muslim Brotherhood. So they talk about, in fact, that there's an extremist side. And when they talk about extremism, it's not just that they're saying that there are some extremists, but in fact, the very way that they want to move when they make laws indicate that it's a broad-based problem with the community. So in France, it becomes putting in laws which then mean that the government approves of and trains imams, and that you can't have imams coming from overseas, which the Austrians also say. It means that, for example, Macron will say, well, I'm speaking to the Muslim leadership. Well, the Muslim leadership is the government appointed, or at least the government cooperating Muslim leadership that run like the main mosque, let's say, in Paris. They've moved very quickly in this last killing of a teacher, which is a terrible and isolated event, to come back with regulations that actually will penalize the Muslim community. When in fact, as I said earlier, the young man that did what he did was from Chechnya, and he's not. There's no sense that he's been an integral part of the Muslim community. And so, in many ways, the rights of Muslims and in the Muslim community has become a concern. So much so that after that event, you then had a situation where two women shouting at two women who were covered wound up being stabbed. Muslim women were being stabbed. So you're developing that sense. And Macron is also playing to the right wing of Le Pen, which is very anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim, but he's playing that card more and more because elections are coming up. But that makes the situation even more dangerous. In Austria, you had a number of attempts to put in regulations, although I'm happy to say that the regulation with regard to the hijab in 2019 was just thrown out by their constitutional court, but they're fairly independent from the hard right government that's in there. The hard right government has moved with raids that have arrested between 30 and 50 people, some of whom I know, some of whom, one or two of whom are prominent academics on Islamophobia in Europe and in Austria, freezing accounts, etc. And they're talking about, more and more monitoring the mainstream community. And in fact, they even define it as a proactive approach, very much like the British. So that means you put in regulations that basically say, none of you are extremists, but in a proactive program, we will kind of look into you and your children and see if the way in which you understand and practice your faith could lead to your becoming an extremist. So it's a very aggressive. And then just a final points on really important ones in which the Ummah has remained quite silent. When you talk about the Rohingya situation, in which you've had genocide and 900,000 going to Bangladesh, where Bangladesh treating their Muslim brothers and sisters so well, put them into these decrepit camps and now put them on an isolated island. And you don't hear many people talking about that. The Uyghurs, where you have an attempt by the government and it's important, by the way, people miss this. The government is now doing something it didn't do before, which is it more and more is emphasizing we're a major Chinese culture, power, government, and everybody's first language should be Chinese. Everybody should be, the way we are. So they've closed down 100 Protestant churches. Although they have an accord with the Vatican, there's pressure there. But with regard to the Uyghurs, they're attempting to eliminate their language and their ethnicity. So more than 1 million have been put in education camps, which are referred to as concentration camps by most experts who write on it. And they live in horrendous conditions and are being, basically educated and brainwashed to operate in a certain way. At the same time, they actually put minders into homes where the husband maybe has been taken out. So you've got somebody who represents the government living in your home or checking on you regularly to see whether you pray regularly, whether you have a Quran, etc. And in India, you have a situation where, in addition to some pogroms that have taken place, you have the charge that it's actually the Muslims who are spreading the coronavirus. And so you have government associated people using phrases like Corona Jihad and Talibani crime. And these things take on a life because, as you know, India is more and more, although everybody celebrates it as this secular democracy, it's more and more under its leader and those that support it and the BJP, they more and more want to impose a Hindu nationalism, which really makes it a Hindu state. And in some ways, there's some parallels there to actually what Israel has done, more recently in talking about the Jewish state. And information on all of that can be found on Bridge. We have major articles on this all the time and on the players.
Thank you very much, Abdullah.
Yeah, I'll try to cover this as quickly as I can. I think, as far as the United States is concerned, it is a very unique case when we think about the status of Muslim minorities in various countries around the world. I think, I've written about this elsewhere. I have an article on American Muslim exceptionalism, which basically looks at the evolution of American Muslim civic and political identity in the United States over time, particularly over the last sort of 40 or 50 years or so. And one of the things that I talk about is the way that, especially after 9/11, of course, not exclusively to the post 9/11 era, but especially forcefully after that point, the way that American Muslim civic identity and political inclusion tends to be very much connected to the question of securitization. And so when we think specifically about a lot of the kind of scandals that emerged in terms of FBI spying, surveillance, political thought policing, the number of prosecutions, the shutting down of charities, the surveilling of mosques and kind of community spaces, the attempt to criminalize, civil rights organizations and sort of put them on and putting people on watch lists and so forth. I mean, thinking about this massive security infrastructure and the way that has a really strong disciplining effect on American Muslim leadership, to the point where if you want to play the political game, you have to abide by certain types of rules in terms of what you're allowed to say, how critical can you be of certain US policies, whether we're talking about domestic policing policies or whether we're talking about US foreign policy in terms of the invasion of Iraq or opposition to what Israel is doing to the Palestinians and specifically US support for that. And so there tends to be a kind of silencing, chilling effect that's taken place as far as even things like the charitable institutions that were developed to help a lot of these issues. And so I think as a result, we've seen very much a tempering of American Muslim political opportunities and ambitions. And despite the fact that, of course, the Trump era sort of put in a very blunt way what some of the Islamophobic inclinations are of certain, institutions within the US government, particularly with things like the Muslim ban. Of course, we know that there was already precedent for those types of policies ahead of time. Historically, they just didn't call them as such, right? That there were already restrictions on immigration. There was already a certain kind of scrutiny to which Muslims were subjected, either while traveling or trying to attempt to gain visas. And yet it was the sort of brazenness of the Trump administration that I think consolidated a certain amount of resistance beyond simply the Muslim community, to the point where you see kind of liberal and progressive forces and even the Democratic Party for the first time taking it upon itself to say, we are actually standing against some of these policies. Again, I think a lot of that is low-hanging fruit. It's very easy to condemn the Muslim ban as sort of an openly racist policy. There has to be a lot more work done in terms of whether the Democratic Party, which of course itself has a very terrible history of supporting a lot of Islamophobic policies and initiatives going all the way back to the Clinton administration in the 90s, which passed a lot of the anti-terrorism laws that actually targeted American Muslims in the first place. And the way that now we see that a lot of those things have carried over to the point where a lot of the most Islamophobic policies within the US government tend to be very much bipartisan or receiving bipartisan support. And on the flip side, I think the American Muslim leadership, in its attempt to gain inclusion, particularly within the Democratic Party, has had to kind of compromise or at least temper its opposition to some of these things, and therefore only focus on things that do have a little bit more of a partisan divide, like the things that Trump did, but not necessarily the things that the Biden administration might continue, particularly in terms of its relationship with law enforcement. We've seen, for instance, that Obama's administration was very much at the behest or sort of the strongest in its support of what's called CVE, countering violent extremism, in which they basically enlist Muslim leaderships around the country to police themselves and to kind of help in the surveilling process and chilling effect within their own communities. Many institutions signed up for those kinds of projects. They received government funding in that regard, and there's been very limited criticism of that as well. We've also seen kind of a lot of pro-Israel normalization projects and a kind of a deep incentivization for a lot of American Muslim leadership. Ironically, at a time when even within sort of American Jewish and Christian trends in general, we're seeing a lot more criticism of Israel in an attempt to sort of distance American Christian and American Jewish support for Israel. We're seeing Muslims in some ways being more heavily enlisted in the opposite direction. And I think that's something also that clearly is an outgrowth of this sort of broader trend in terms of how the securitization of American Muslims has functioned. But I know we're pressed for time, so I'll just leave my comments there.
Thank you so much, Professor Abdullah. Before we move to our final segment, Professor Heba, I wanted to ask you, usually we think of Islamophobia as something that is a violent process that moves from non-Muslims against Muslim minorities. However, a recent scholarship of Islamophobia has shown that the policing of Muslim subjectivities, especially their self-expression, is not only something that non-Muslims are guilty of, however, Muslim majority countries, government policies as well. Could you give us a little bit of your analysis of what you think is the state of Islamophobia within Muslim societies?
I think it's an outcome of the security networks, official security networks, organization. It has been said that before and after the Arab Spring, many of the ties between Arab countries were loosening and not getting very strong, except for the ministries of interior. It's the only meeting that regularly took place, the meeting of the ministers of interior of the Arab world. So, and people in Tunisia used to tell us that it's the Egyptian police that taught the techniques of torture to the Tunisian ones, and they used to blame us for that, in a way. So it's I think it's a matter of spreading this security mentality and then affecting very much the media, because in the case of Egypt, for example, there has been media companies established that actually monopolize completely the Egyptian media, and they produce films and produce series, etc., to basically tarnish. And this has been going on for many years. I mean, since the different films of Adil Imam, for those who are following the Egyptian cinema, till sometimes mixing jokes with the attacks on Islamism. I mean, comedia, and eventually the modern. The most recent series that have been produced and cinematic works. So it affects very much some people, and then eventually people say, okay, we don't want to have anything with Islamism, we are going to be like pious Muslims. And then you can find the ups and downs. You can see some signs of I wouldn't call it a wave, but emergence of some atheistic trends. But on the other side, Sufism is flourishing. So those who drop out of Islamism join Sufism, which was not the case previously. And then you have people simply, I have many students who just are simple Muslims who decided that they don't know enough. They got confused by the misinformation, and then they decided to get the right information. So they enrolled, though they are very average Muslims, in terms of practicing, etc. They started attending durus, attending different circles, attending different public lectures on Islam in Al-Azhar and other places, because they felt there is something going wrong here. So it's very complicated, and of course, as I mentioned earlier, the minorities in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, the religious minorities, because of so many violent attacks against some of their churches, and some were massacres, actually small massacres. There is that trend of not identifying with Islam. And there are so many reasons that they are now trying to revive again their languages. The Syrian church is doing this, becoming more and more proud of the old language. The Egyptian church is promoting learning Coptic. Basically, it did not reach the political level. It's more rooted into pulling yourself together and keeping the minority together, but it can have definitely political implications. And this hostility towards whatever is Arabic, it's trending now in some circles here and there. So I think this is not an innocent development. It's because of the systemic demonization of Islamism, but also on that vehicle, demonization of Islam itself. And I think a lot of effort has to be done here. Average people don't have a voice, basically. They are not given any voice on the media. And still, this machine, like Abdullah mentioned, and it's still going on, the machine of official Islam and the state-owned Islam that is trying to show that everything that is not under its umbrella is basically radical, fundamentalist, terrorist. So there is a lot going on that needs more attention, and I don't think that the classic discourse will help. It's a new world, and the notions that are spreading now are very challenging. And there needs to be some sort of serious development of some. I mean, the era of the new dua al-judud is over, and with lot of disappointments. So something else has to emerge that is more oriented to the faith itself, you know, keeping the faith of people, but at the same time with a discourse that is, from my perspective, depoliticized on the individual and collective level, highly politicized in terms of rationality and understanding the world. So part of your understanding of the world would be to understand the different maps of Islam as well.
Thank you very much. We'll go to our concluding session. Dr. Al-Arian.
Thank you very much, Owais. Thank you, everybody. It's been an exhausting evening. I know, indulge me, this is the last segment. I'm going to merge both the last segment with your closing statements. Our last segment was on major challenges facing the Islamic world in the 20 years. If you care to comment about it, you can lump it into your closing statement. I'm going to give each one of you about 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes, and we'll start in the reversing order. So we'll start with Abdullah, then Ismail, then Hamid, then Heba, then Dr. Esposito. Abdullah.
Yeah, I'll just say quickly, I think, you know, echoing a little bit of what Dr. Heba just mentioned, you know, when we ask the question, why does Islamism even exist? Where did it come from? Why did it even happen in the first place? One of the things to keep in mind is the fact that this entire trend of political Islam emerged, you know, 100 years ago, in part because of the gradual and very systematic dismantling of traditional Islamic authority institutions that happened both by internal modernizers, so by people whether within the Ottoman Empire who were very rapidly modernizing, or within Egypt under Muhammad Ali, or by colonialism, right? And so colonial institutions and colonial powers, as well as internal modernizing forces, both slowly were dismantling the positions of Muslim authority, which then necessitated the emergence of this sort of lay Islamic intellectual activist in the form of a number of figures who did not have actually official positions within the state or within kind of official Islamic institutions. And this is what brings about this phenomenon of Islamism that we've come to know for the past century or so. And what's ironic is when we turn back now and look at sort of what various states are doing, whether we're talking about what's happening in Egypt and the UAE or Saudi Arabia, or even what's happening in Macron in France. I mean, this is something that Professor Esposito mentioned just previously as well. That now all of a sudden the huge irony is the fact that these states are trying to kind of reestablish an official Islam in a way to combat the lure of Islamism, right? And I think that this is kind of one of the massive ironies that we've seen in the last sort of decade or so, is that they're calling on the establishment of official Muslim authorities to delegitimize popular Islamic forces from within society and the emergence of. And so I think that this as a phenomenon is something that's worth exploring as part of a broader historical development, is seeing this phenomenon come full circle, essentially, to the point where Macron is saying, you know, we want official imams that are essentially licensed and given certificates from the state, to the point where Sisi is going to Al-Azhar and deciding we need to actually not only credential every person, but we need to know what's being said at every single Friday khutbah in every mosque across the country, which of course is a logistical impossibility. And yet the fact that it's even an ambition of the state says something. That's, you know, even historically something that was never possible. And so I think to that degree, it's important to think about sort of what are the responses. There has to be a popular response in the form of saying, you know, we want to reclaim the Islamic tradition in such a way that does give ordinary people the ability to express themselves, to be able to come up with their own solutions and creative, innovative ways of sort of pulling the Islamic tradition in a way that is not simply there in the service of political power, that's not there in the service of colonial powers or modern day tyrants, but is something that actually represents the impulses of people, that represents the aspirations of people, both on a political, social, human level, in a way that I think, it's something that I think Rashid Ghannouchi has mentioned many times, where he talks about liberating Islam from the state as opposed to using the state to impose Islamism. And so this sort of reversal, I think, is something that we're seeing as probably one of the major challenges. Of course, there are many others I could mention, but I'll just leave it there.
Thank you, Ismail.
I'll try to make 3 quick points. First, a point that Owais brought up and in some ways also mentioned in Abdullah's presentation, that democracy's legitimacy is being eroded. Well, part of it is in the Arab Spring countries. We see something like Arab Spring fatigue, that people are tired of talking about it. People miss the good old days of autocracy, a semblance of order, at least some order is going on. But there's also at the political theoretical level, we see an increase in arguments that question the very root of democracy. So democracy is sort of seen as a Westernese, a Western language, and Muslims are constantly trying to be part of that Western language, and they will never be part of it. The West will never see Muslims as being truly democratic. They will never grant it, and all that. I am somewhat troubled by these arguments. Because not that democracy is a panacea, not that it's a quick fixer of anything. It's actually the very process that is valuable, and I think we sometimes miss that point. And I think it has serious consequences, because it's not just in the West that we see nativistic, right-wing populistic movements. We actually see it everywhere, and these movements increasingly take on this discourse of bashing democracy. Oh, you see, the American democracy is fake and this is that. Yes, democracies everywhere have significant problems, but when we get into the business of bashing democracy, first we miss the fact that we are in the same boat of bashing the democracy in the Middle East, in the Muslim world, together with the Islamophobes. Who argue that Muslims are not ripe for democracy. Muslims, their religion, their culture is not. John Esposito is the person that has written extensively on this issue. I think that's a very, because of, in the interest of time, I have to cut short, but I think I find that line of thinking a little bit problematic. That I also see in the rise in the Muslim world. The second point is about the challenges that Dr. Sami Al-Arian pointed out. When we think of challenges facing Muslim world, we always, of course, automatically think about things like the Palestine or Rohingya Muslims or the Uyghur Muslims, and these are very right causes, very right problems. But we sometimes, I think, lose the universalistic aspect of what we aspire to. It is almost like we Muslims talk about Muslim stuff, and as if we have nothing to say about global challenges, global issues, global problems to the global public sphere. As if it is a climate change, if it is nuclear armament, if it is urban transformation, if it is about global distribution of wealth, if it is about international development, we have not much thing to say. I think that's a very big problem. And when Mahmoud Mamdani was talking about getting out of the ghetto, I think I take this to mean also this aspect of it, that Muslims have to engage with global problems facing the global population, the humanity, and not just only Muslim issues. I think that's a very important thing. And lastly, and very shortly, on a general note, I think we have to distinguish between political and politics. Politics is an ongoing matrix of relations, balances and imbalances of power. It's any state of politics, any within the established order, within established mechanisms. But the political is way bigger than that. It's more constitutive. It establishes a vision. It's actually more about your vision, your what kind of a society you want to see in the future, what kind of a constitution you want to see. If we collapse politics into the political, or if we collapse political into the politics, then we get lost in the intricacies of Middle East realpolitik, the balance of power, sectarianism, and everything. That's why in my opening remarks, I was talking about, how are we to think beyond these questions in theoretic terms, and how can we put it in fruitful dialogue with practice. And I want to leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Hamid?
I think one of the negative consequences of the Arab Spring has been the complete breakdown of relations between the main countries in the Muslim world, such as between Turkey and Syria, Iran and Saudi Arabia, Turkey and Saudi Arabia, Qatar and UAE and Saudi Arabia. And to be honest with you, I don't think this is beneficial for anyone. I mean, I'm not naive. I'm not proposing that we hold hands and sing kumbaya. We do have very conflicting ideologies, even conflicting interests. Nevertheless, I think the level of hostilities we've had in the past few years, I don't think they serve the interests of anyone, including the United States. I mean, these divisions in the Middle East have actually allowed for the penetration of the Middle East by China and Russia. So even if the Americans were smart, they wouldn't have, encouraged these divisions. I think the only party that is benefiting from this are the Israelis. And the reason the Trump administration was following this policy was not because it was in US interest, but rather it was following Israeli interests. And I think when we're talking about the future, every country has to think about de-escalating the situation first, and then hopefully bridging the gap as much as possible. And hopefully we will have a brighter future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Heba.
I was thinking about your next conference, whether I can suggest a topic.
Absolutely.
And I think that being very overoccupied with either the political, military, economic, societal, etc., somehow we look from inside to outside. So we don't sort of travel above our ummatic concerns and maybe have a look outside and then come back. And I think that especially on the notion of Islamophobia, but also international politics and the different alliances, the role of religion has been undermined. And there is a growing literature now trying to recapture the importance of the role of religion in decision making, even if it is manipulated by national interests or even economic interests. But there is a rise in the use specifically of Christianity in international relations, and some alliances are emerging on that ground. Europe is transforming. Of course, it tries to keep itself look secular, and the Islamophobic wave is trying to defend freedom of expression, etc. But there is a very clear, to me at least, Christian notions that are underlining this. And I think that we need to go beyond the dialogue between civilizations and bringing Christians to talk about the great history, etc. But we need to objectively study the rise of Christianity on the international level, specifically Orthodoxy. And Huntington, when he talked about the conflict and the clash between civilizations, of course, we have the balanced view in Islam. There is a degree of conflict and there is a degree of cooperation, and we move in between. We don't have this romanticism. We know that the world is a world of conflict, basically, but we promote values and we wish for peace. But we focused very much on Western Islamic confrontations and Western Islamic conflicts. And one of the civilizations that he counted was Orthodoxy. And we have this ambivalent relation between Turkey and Russia, for example. We have the clear hostility by Hungary and Austria based on very deep hostilities historically and old wars. And as if this shadows all the time the policies, even if they are not in the discourse. So I think this topic actually deserves a lot of attention. The rise of the role of the Orthodox Church in Russia, its approachment to its cooperation now with the Catholic Church, and there is so much talk, especially also in Egypt, because of the Orthodox Church, regarding uniting the dates of Easter. This has been going on for 2 years. Trump declared a year ago they celebrated so far two celebrations, an annual day for Coptic Christians. There is something coming up, and I think that it should be studied more. We didn't give it enough attention so far. So I suggest how this would have an impact on the Ummah, and how the realm of international politics is now more and more shaped by these religious shadows. I think this is important.
Perhaps we can draft you into the program committee to help us out with this.
Well, I would be very happy. I've been following the issue for some time now, and I'm really disturbed. Yeah.
Recently, we invited someone from China to give a talk about Confucianism and the model, and it was, I think, a great talk to open our eyes. Our last but not least is Professor Esposito.
Yeah, well, as a few of you know, I usually don't pay attention to the question of my age. And the way I avoid that is to say that I run 6 to 8 miles in the morning. So then people, that blunts them from trying to figure out my age. The reason I'm saying that is because what I'm going to say now, when I got into the field, which would have been late 60s, early 70s, I was in graduate school during that period, finished my PhD in 1974. I knew in my lifetime that surely there would be peace in Palestine. There would be a Palestinian state. I knew that. And I felt sorry for all the people who were experts, political scientists, and were retiring, because I thought, my God, it's like somebody who like works on a cure for cancer for 40 years and doesn't find it. What do you feel like when you retire? You know, I look at the situation now, and things are worse than they could ever be in many ways. And I watch these Arab and Muslim countries who, you know, jump off to align themselves with the UAE, but then, you know, in the next breath say, but of course, you know, we're still supportive of Palestine. And I know that that's politics, and I know that it proves that, you know, that in fact they're like most politicians and governments, they don't have any real principles. But I think that you know, we're seeing a lot of going backwards. We're seeing a lot of going backwards in terms of the far right in politics across Europe, across the United States, and across many parts of the world to a degree that we didn't expect. You know, years ago, the idea was you take, you know, maybe 3 steps forward and you go 1 step backwards. You know, that's not the case now. We've gone 2 or 3 steps backwards in many of the ways in which, you know, the extent to which we actually see ourselves as, put aside the word democracy if you don't like it, but talk about freedoms, human freedom, you know, the freedom of people. You know, as an outsider who's seen what my country's gone through, which is unbelievable, but has looked at other countries in the world, you know, having traveled in Egypt before some of you were born, and to Turkey, et cetera, and I look and think, where the hell are we? I mean, where are we going? And I think we need to be concerned as scholars and citizens about that kind of movement forward. I think that it's, I mean, it's an abomination to have to listen to the ambassador of the UAE in the United States, or to listen to the UAE government talk about how progressive and open they are, and how they're all reaching out to Israel. And at the same time, they're not reaching out when it comes to Palestine. But I think also there's a challenge with regard to realizing what, you know, that Muslim governments are like other governments. And that's kind of sad, because if you want to talk about the Ummah all the time, having been listening to the word Ummah since I was, 36 or something, I mean, I really get tired when the word is used, because more often it's used in an empty way. You know, it's like referring to a nice ideal when it's convenient. Where is there an ummah when you look at Muslim countries and their relationships today? It seems worse than in the past, you know what I mean? Or at least much more conflictual, you know? I mean, anybody who looks at the Middle East, it's, you know, and I think that's important. And the last one is a religious thing. I think that, you know, there is, I use this term in the broadest sense, there is a struggle for the soul of Islam. But there's a struggle for the soul of Catholicism, et cetera, et cetera. And I think people really need to wake up and be aware of that. You know, for religious traditions, it's how do you move forward and have diversity, but how do you do it in a way in which you don't get a polarization? And so you have these very conflicting kinds of positions being taken, whether it's within Roman Catholicism with regard to this last election, or whether you're talking about dealing with Muslim politics, etc. I had a very prominent mufti, Grand Mufti. If I mentioned his name, you would see him in a very positive light. And I was in Qatar, and he called me over. He saw me in the lounge and said, John, come here, you know, and we sat down. And he said, you know, everybody thinks it's Clash of Civilizations. No, it's Sunni Shia, you know. And so we talked a bit, and then it became, But of course, I can't say anything when I see this going on in another country to the Grand Mufti of another country like Malaysia, whatever, because it's really his business. It's really his business. So that's why I don't say anything about it. Well, you know, and this is true with the first thing that I brought up with, which I'll bring back to the end. You know, where are the Muslim countries, not only with their mouth because they want to be seen leaders in the Muslim world, where are they speaking about and doing anything about the Uyghurs,
Yes,
the Rohingyas, and the Palestinians? I mean, this is enough to make one teary. And unfortunately, I have a propensity to do that, so I will stop right now.
thank you, John, for so much for everything you're doing, particularly today for bringing the plight of the Uyghurs and the Rohingyas and the Palestinians into this discussion. Thank you, and thank you for the whole panel. This has been a very enlightening, rich, informative, illuminating, educational. I really enjoyed having this conversation with you. I asked for 20 minutes, we went 50 minutes over. So thank you very much for staying the whole time with us. And I hope to welcome you next year in Istanbul after this coronavirus is gone.
Yeah.
Inshallah. And certainly I would like to ask the audience to give you a virtual hand for staying with us the full time. Let me just make some concluding remarks, because this is the official end of our conference. In the past week, we've been here at SIGA engaged in a serious discussion and conversation on governance and political authority in the Islamic world. During this period, we've heard over 50 scholars, in fact, 58 scholars to be exact, from 22 countries in 14 sessions, covering over 7 days, covering almost 30 hours of serious, engaging presentations, fruitful, I hope. SIGA was met with this challenge, and I think we've met that challenge. It was a great challenge, and I think we've met that challenge. And we promise that this conversation on politics and governance will continue. This is just a beginning, and we hope to expand it with more detailed and focused studies and research on those topics that we covered this. In conclusion, I'd like to thank my staff, my SIGA staff. You know, we have a lot of people behind the scenes who have been working very hard to bring this to fruition. Yunus Agdeniz, Owais Khan, my co-moderator for this session, Fadi Za'atari, Ubaid Raouf, Jalal Khushaib, Razia Wadoud, Jamal Adam Muhammad, Imad Atawi, Dilek Kumadan, Abdurrahman Migdad, Taimur Tanvir, Abdullah Jurat, Yumna Sulaiman, Simon Rashid, Maryam Khan, Omar Fili, Taqwa Nidal, and Sahar Sadiq. I also would like to thank our translators, the Arabic translators, Maher Awauda and Mary Khouri, who come to us from Ramallah, by the way, and for the Arabic translation, and our Turkish translator, Murat Bilgutay and Sibla Kuchuk. Both have been also helping us with our Turkish translation. And I also would like to end by thanking particularly Yunus Agdeniz and Taimur Tanvir, who have been working on the technical side of this. They have been managing an unbelievable amount of traffic and all kinds of technical details. I want to thank them for their hard work and for making this happen. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for the audience for tuning in. And I hope to see you next year. We are exhausted, need some rest. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.